In 1998, at the Tokyo Fantastic International Film Festival, two men found themselves standing next to each other while queuing to see John Carpenter's Vampires. Now, unfortunately, there was a problem with the cinema's equipment, and so to pass the time, they struck up a conversation and discovered that they had a considerable amount in common. They both worked in the video game industry. They were both writer-directors and had both been on a run of successful releases that were starting to pick up steam outside of Japan. As the hours passed by, they debated storytelling and direction, traded ideas about the films that inspired them, and even joked that they would one day create a game together. After 8 long hours standing outside the Shibuya Parthenon, the cinema finally opened its doors. But for both men, it wasn't the film that they'd waited for, but this chance encounter that would make the night so memorable. This is a story that was told by Konami's Hideo Kojima and Squaresoft's Yasumi Matsuno while giving an interview together in 1999. The two were talking about how important cinema was in the creation of their respective games, and jokingly used that night in Tokyo as an example of just how different they felt they were from the rest of the industry. Now, when talking about Hideo Kojima, that all goes without saying. The man has created some of the most captivating video games ever made, enjoys a legacy 3 decades long, and remains as relevant in high definition as he was back in the world of 16-bit graphics. He's a legend of the industry. But what about the other man in that anecdote? What about Yasumi Matsuno? In that very same interview, Kojima described him as someone who could push the industry to exciting new places, someone who shared his design DNA. And yet, as of 2023, Yasumi Matsuno hasn't written or directed a full console title in over 20 years. The sad tale of his career is one of the industry's greatest tragedies. But in order to understand how he fell from such lofty acclaim, we're going to have to explore the strange history of his final completed game, Vagrant Story. Just like its creator, Matsuno's console swan song was at one time considered one of the finest video games in its class, an exceptional achievement in fantasy storytelling, RPG system design, and cinematic art direction, the shining conclusion to Squaresoft's storied PlayStation 1 catalogue. And yet, again, just like its creator, it's endured 20 years of silence and neglect. Left behind while its siblings receive remake after remaster after remake, with any trace of its former glory found only in quiet whispers in some forgotten corner of the internet. Well, today our two protagonists will receive the redemption they deserve. This is the story of both Ashley Riot and Yasumi Matsuno, one in Tokyo and the other in Lea Monde, one wielding the pen and the other the sword, both desperately deserving of the acclamation that time and distance have stripped away. This is a lengthy Vagrant Story retrospective, and now the slowest dance can begin. It may be a YouTube retrospective cliche, but in order to properly fathom both the creation of Vagrant Story and the events that led to Matsuno's departure from frontline development, we need to understand him as a person, and that requires turning back the clock to 1965. Yasumi Matsuno was born to a middle-class family in rural Japan, and from a young age he'd been singularly obsessed with storytelling. He'd spend hours devouring every comic and novel he could get his hands on, watching and rewatching movies that his parents brought home, and indulging in his favourite pastime, making dioramas of battlefields with history books borrowed from the local library. This powerful imagination meant that when he discovered his first arcade in the late 1970s, he immediately fell in love with the world of video games, and spent hours destroying aliens and space invaders and piloting starships in Xevious. Now, this is where I'd usually tell you that this passion caused him to head off and study computer science before joining a big Japanese developer, but that is surprisingly not the way this story goes. Matsuno loved playing games and writing stories, but it was very much a hobby, and at the age of 18, he enrolled at the University of Hosei in Tokyo, where he studied the decidedly non-creative foreign policy. Now eventually he did drop out in order to pursue a career as a writer, but it proved much harder than he'd imagined, and for most of the 1980s, Matsuno worked at a big news corporation, where he produced articles about international politics. It was deeply unsatisfying stuff, and he found himself increasingly turning to video games for escapism, spending most of his nights exploring the worlds of Dragon Quest and The Legend of Zelda, trying to forget about the rigid and structured workplace that denied his storytelling soul. Well, in 1989, everything changed. After seeing an advertisement for a video game scriptwriting job, Matsuno took a chance and applied. Incredibly, despite having zero experience within the industry, he was accepted. And just like that, the dreary corporate career ended, and he found himself forging characters and worlds in a medium that he loved. Now, the company that had hired Matsuno was called Quest, and very quickly he became an important team member, contributing large amounts of work to Quest's next release. This was 1990's Conquest of the Crystal Palace, which, despite looking like a bog-standard Japanese NES platformer, actually offers a few hints of what's to come. Matsuno was credited as both a writer and designer, and I feel like you can see his influence in both of these areas, as the game is far more ambitious than it has any right to be. We play as Farron, a young warrior who discovers that he's the Prince of the Crystal Palace, and the game consists of 5 levels where we fight to beat back the forces of darkness and liberate his ancestral home. On the surface, it's nothing that original, but in what would become Matsuno's signature move, he spent countless hours constructing the game's narrative, and it ended up far more complex than most other 8-bit titles. The manual contains 2 pages of detailed backstory, and throughout the game, there are news reports that update the player on the state of the kingdom and the fallout from their adventures. By NES standards, this was positively cinematic. But the complexity didn't end there, as Matsuno and fellow designer Takaharu Mita dreamt up all manner of ways to keep the simple gameplay engaging. Before you start your adventure, you can choose between 3 unique builds that each play differently, and in between levels, Farron visits a shop full of upgrades and spells where you can spend money gained from defeating enemies. There are optional bosses, hidden items, and even an entire set of mechanics that revolve around a magical dog called Zap, and it adds up to so much more than just an action platformer. When it was released, it was successful enough to warrant an English language translation, and while sales were pretty modest in comparison to the likes of Zelda and Mario, for Quest, it was their biggest hit by some distance. Within less than a year, Matsuno had become a crucial cog in the machine, and thanks to his work on Conquest of the Crystal Palace, the directors promoted him to the company's creative lead, and gave him free rein to design whatever he wanted next. Now, even at this early point in his career, Matsuno was looking to do business differently, and in interviews years later, he spoke about how, instead of chasing reviews or sales, his team was singularly focused on creating something unique. This philosophy led to the release of Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen in March 1993 for the SNES, and just like Conquest of the Crystal Palace, it pushed Quest to a whole new level. Given Matsuno's main strengths were in world building, story writing, and system design, the obvious next step was to create a role-playing game. But he didn't want to compete with Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, and so the team ended up taking those ideas in a very different direction. Where RPGs typically had you micromanaging characters and exploring dark caves, everything in Ogre Battle operates on a much grander scale. Inspired by titles like Fire Emblem and Nobunaga's Ambition, the game's levels represent entire continents, and players are expected to control up to 20 battalions of wizards, knights, and archers as conflict rages in real time. Now, while the moment-to-moment gameplay revolves around nothing more than moving soldiers and watching battles, there's far more going on here than at first glance. Instead of quick reactions, the game is based on thoughtfully planning ahead and juggling a monstrous amount of systems that govern your army's strength. You have to carefully manage squad formations to get the best out of different soldiers, decide which classes your squads should be made up of, liberate cities in order to get items and powerful battle cards, and manipulate the alignment of your army, which affects if it's strong in the day or at night. And that's all on top of traditional RPG ideas like acquiring new gear and leveling up. It's a hell of a lot to get your head around, but the depth it creates is highly impressive, And considering RTS games on PC were still in their infancy, the team at Quest deserves a lot of credit for making it work with a console and controller. Now, while all this made Ogre Battle extremely distinct to play, its most unique element was unsurprisingly its storytelling, as Matsuno was able to leverage his background as an international journalist and create a world that felt like a reflection of our own. Rather than mimicking the Chosen One stories that dominated other SNES RPGs, Matsuno crafted a tale of bloody revolution within a repressive empire, and tried to make the world of Zetagenia as realistic as he could. Different regions believe in different interpretations of the world's mythology, and characters all have conflicting political opinions, which in turn prompt player choices about who they should align with. All these choices lead to an amazing 13 different endings, and this combination of creating a highly detailed world but allowing the player to express themselves within it, well, it made Ogre Battle very popular in hardcore RPG circles. Now, if games were judged solely on their ambition alone, Ogre Battle would go down as a stone cold classic, but ironically, for all of its complex gameplay and interlocking storytelling, most of the critical acclaim centered around its presentation, with outlets like EGM and Nintendo Power gushing over its high quality graphics and sound. During development, Matsuno formed a really strong relationship with two artists called Hiroshi Minagawa and Akihiko Yoshida, who both handled art direction and character design. The three found working together extremely easy, and this made for a relaxed atmosphere where people could experiment and feel listened to by management. The same was true of the game's soundtrack, which was handled by another duo, Hitoshi Sakamoto and Masaharu Iwata. The two were deeply talented musicians, but didn't have many games under their belt, something that would have usually meant years of assisting before getting to produce their own soundtrack. As something of an outsider himself, Matsuno was happy to look past this and let the two run wild, with his faith repaid with an excellent cinematic score that perfectly suits the themes of warfare and betrayal. These 5 developers, Matsuno, Minagawa, Yoshida, Sakamoto and Iwata, were really the heart and soul of Quest Corporation, and thanks to their ridiculously high standard of work, Ogre Battle was picked up by RPG giant Enix and published worldwide to much higher sales than expected. In interviews years later, Matsuno talked about how the team decided that they'd be happy with just 100,000 units shipped, but within a few months they got news that Ogre Battle had sold 500,000 units. Within a few years it was ported to the PlayStation 1 and the Sega Saturn, and amidst rave reviews in both Japanese and English, it was clear that they'd not only created a hit, but a bona fide classic. Where Quest was once almost entirely unknown outside of Japan, they now had Nintendo begging them to release a sequel, and so Matsuno's dream team immediately got to work, although it was once again not the follow-up people expected. Apparently influenced by how Ridley Scott had followed up Alien with the markedly different Aliens, Matsuno decided that Quest's next major title should be a similar reinvention, and instead of simply building on the foundation of Ogre Battle, his team once again aimed to make something entirely unique. With a much higher budget and over 2 years of development time, they plunged into the creation of Tactics Ogre: Let Us Cling Together, which was eventually released in 1995 on the Super Nintendo, and similarly made enormous waves in the industry. The most obvious differences were the change in scale and perspective, as instead of a real-time pulled-back strategy game, Tactics Ogre took the player much closer to the battlefield and asked them to play out isometric grid-based skirmishes that functioned like an RPG version of chess. Now, this change was apparently driven by Minagawa, who is a huge fan of the NES game Solstice, but it's also hard to imagine that Matsuno's childhood love of creating historical dioramas didn't also play a big role. Regardless of where it came from, the change was inspired, and thanks to the new perspective, things like elevation, positioning and terrain could play a much bigger role, and this meant that Tactics Ogre had a lot more depth, despite having fewer units on screen. That same dynamic is true of the RPG systems, as while you no longer manage an entire army, each individual party member can be deeply customised, with almost 20 unique classes to unlock, which each bring a massive amount of utility. There are dragoons and berserkers, warlocks and necromancers, gunsmiths and ninjas, alongside beast tamers that can subjugate monsters, and a whole host of unique characters that you can recruit under the right circumstances. With an elemental alignment system that can boost or reduce damage, and a loyalty gauge that changes based on actions you take in the story, it's substantially more complex than Ogre Battle. But thanks to the reduced scale, it never feels overwhelming, and your progression is always clear and obvious. Now, while these gameplay changes were very well received, and the art and sound design once again delivered at a very high level, it was Matsuno's storytelling that stole the show, and saw his writing and ambition reach a whole new level. Rather surprisingly, Tactics Ogre wasn't a direct sequel, with Matsuno telling journalists that while the two games would both contribute to the overall Ogre Battle saga, they were taking place in different parts of Zetagenia at different times. Now, this love of creating multiple stories within the same world would also become a hallmark of Matsuno's later work, but here it was primarily driven by him wanting to create a different kind of story, one that was less fantastical and much darker in tone. As a student of international politics, he'd been deeply influenced by events happening around the world, and sadly, the early 1990s were characterised by brutal warfare in Eastern Europe during the collapse of Yugoslavia. Horrified by what he saw in the news, Matsuno found himself penning a story that leaned even harder into murky moral relativism, telling a heartbreaking tale of a kingdom disintegrating and the consequences for the people that call it their home. Dealing with topics like ethnic cleansing, racism, class warfare, and nationalism, it was a million miles from the cartoon stylings that dominated the genre, and earned Quest a lot of plaudits for dealing with such heavy subject matter. Now, unfortunately, as much as this ambition made Tactics Ogre into such a special game, it also proved to be something of a hindrance, as the team found the development process to be very challenging and had to cut lots of features as the years ticked by and Nintendo and Quest piled on the pressure for a finished game. Originally, Matsuno had wanted to have a completely free-form narrative that reacted constantly to the player's choices, but this had to be stripped back as deadlines approached and the team had to focus on finishing all the animations and graphical effects. Sadly, it also ended up impacting the game's sales, as Tactics Ogre was released very late in the SNES's life cycle, managing to release after the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation had hit the market. Its fantastic reviews and obvious quality still meant that it shipped 500,000 units, but with players being dazzled by the burgeoning world of 3D gaming, it was less than Matsuno and Quest had hoped for, and meant that ports had to be hastily thrown together in order to keep copies moving. Considering what an artistic and cinematic achievement Tactics Ogre was, Matsuno was deeply frustrated with its release, and in particular found himself clashing with Quest leadership over his management style and creative ambition. Just as dissatisfaction had reared its head back when he was a journalist, in 1995 those same feelings were bubbling up. And so incredibly, Yasumi Matsuno took a giant leap into the unknown and quit Quest with immediate effect. So just like in the Ogre Battle saga, our next chapter begins in a different time, with an entirely different cast of characters. On the other side of Tokyo to Quest lay the headquarters of Squaresoft, and within their mighty walls, another legendary developer was busy making his own mark on the role-playing genre. This was Hironobu Sakaguchi, and under his leadership, Final Fantasy had become a sensation of a franchise, second only to Dragon Quest in Japan, and easily the most popular RPG series outside of it. By the mid-1990s, Squaresoft had released 6 highly acclaimed entries, but as another example of a developer obsessed with creativity and invention, Sakaguchi constantly pushed his teams to experiment outside of Square's Golden Goose. This led to the release of classic games like Live Alive, Chrono Trigger, Front Mission, and Secret of Mana. But while all of these were highly acclaimed, what Sakaguchi dreamt of was a Square-produced strategy game. You see, he was a huge fan of Nintendo's Fire Emblem, and in an interview with Famitsu in 1994, he claimed it was his favourite franchise. often playing it all through the night and queuing up for hours every time a new game was released. He was so passionate about the genre that in 1992 he'd registered the trademark for Final Fantasy Tactics. But as the mainline Final Fantasy series became increasingly popular, he found himself with no time to transform his dream into a reality. So this brings us back to 1995 and the next stage in the career of Yasumi Matsuno. Now most people seem to think that Sakaguchi headhunted Matsuno and poached him from Quest, but both men have confirmed that this was not the case in several interviews. In fact, after Matsuno left Quest, he'd simply looked at which companies were hiring, and after seeing that Squaresoft were looking for planners, he'd applied and been accepted. Now obviously he didn't stay as a planner for very long, and once Sakaguchi caught wind of the company's new hire, Matsuno found himself in the executive vice president's office being shown the design document for Final Fantasy Tactics. By Matsuno's own account, a Final Fantasy strategy game was his dream project, and after begging Sakaguchi to put him in charge, he once again found himself helming a major project mere weeks after joining a new company. Now despite all this, the rumours of headhunting likely do have some truth in them, as very quickly the Final Fantasy Tactics team began to fill up with ex-Quest developers. There isn't any clear timeline for this, but we do know that Minagawa, Yoshida, Sakamoto and Iwata all joined Squaresoft that same year, and for all intents and purposes, Final Fantasy Tactics was a spiritual successor to Tactics Ogre, as it was developed by the very same team. Along with the staff, it shared the same isometric grid-based perspective, the same class-based progression system, and the same focus on gritty realism over high fantasy. In fact, it was shaping up to be so similar that Sakaguchi asked Final Fantasy VI director Hiroyuki Ito to join the team as a designer in order to make sure that Tactics felt like a part of the series that it took its name from. Ito proved to be an interesting addition to the team, as he didn't actually like strategy RPGs, and essentially spent the entire development cycle trying to balance out Matsuno's inclination towards hardcore system-driven gaming. In Ito's own words, he wanted Tactics to feel swashbuckling and exciting, and this clash of ideals ended up producing something very special. As I've already mentioned, Final Fantasy Tactics is largely based on the Tactics Ogre formula, but it does make some key changes that in my view elevate the experience to a whole new level. For starters, the number of controllable characters has been reduced, and this increases the focus on party building, which is made all the more enjoyable as the class system is basically lifted from Final Fantasy V. Instead of having to progress through the story in order to unlock new moves and jobs, it's all done on your own terms, and heavily rewards players that want to experiment and find interesting combinations. Another big change is that Final Fantasy Tactics was released on the PlayStation 1 rather than the Super Nintendo, and this meant that Matsuno's team had access to much more storage than they were used to. Now most of Squaresoft's PlayStation games use this to load up on ambitious CGI cutscenes, but surprisingly, Tactics doesn't contain all that many, and instead most of the additional space was given over to Sakamoto and Iwata for the game's soundtrack. At first, both were intimidated by having to live up to the legendary work of Nobuo Uematsu, but once again, by closely working with Matsuno, they produced another wonderful OST that proved to be so popular that Square began selling it as a separate CD album. Combined with Yoshida's distinctive characters and Minagawa's eye for sprite and environmental design, Final Fantasy Tactics was essentially the culmination of everything Quest had been building towards. And nowhere is this more clear than in the writing of Yasumi Matsuno. Much like in the gameplay, he decided to really sharpen his storytelling, and while Tactics still involves numerous morally questionable factions, a raging transcontinental war and dark conspiracies bubbling under the surface, it's actually a far more human story than he'd ever previously penned. Everything revolves around two men, Ramza and Deletia, childhood friends who find themselves in ideological opposition about how to save their homeland of Evilis from the rot at the heart of its society. In true Final Fantasy fashion, there's a big chunk of supernatural darkness, but the vast majority of the intrigue comes from the clash between these two men, both trying to do what they believe is right and struggling to deal with the consequences of each other's actions. Just like in Tactics Ogre, this dark and realistic spin on the traditional JRPG formula works extremely well. But Matsuno took things a step further and added a fascinating framing device where the whole game is being told as if it's a recently discovered historical document. Once again taking influence from real-world events, he was inspired by the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how important historical figures and events can be so easily lost to time. It all gives Ivalice and the Zodiac Brave story a feeling of real scale, like it has a history that spans both into the past and future, perfectly expressing the maximalist style that he'd been developing since he first entered the industry. On release in 1997, Final Fantasy Tactics was a critical hit, garnering rave reviews in both English and Japanese, and quickly outselling anything that the team from Quest had ever worked on. Aided by the runaway popularity of the Final Fantasy name, by the end of the year it had sold 1.5 million copies and been nominated for a slew of awards, essentially confirming Matsuno as one of the industry's brightest rising stars and giving Sakaguchi the strategy RPG that he'd always wanted. Now, time has been a little harsher to Square's tactical masterpiece, and its glowing reputation has slowly given way to quite a bit of criticism. Despite Hiroyuki Ito's best endeavours, Matsuno was still able to pour a lot of complexity into the gameplay, and much of it is now seen as not actually adding much to the overall experience. Esoteric systems like the Brave and Faith stats, and each character having one of 12 Zodiac alignments, all feel quite poorly explained, and it can make for a game that doesn't always do a good job of telling players what's important and what isn't. On top of this, Tactics also has some of the most notorious difficulty spikes in RPG history, with one fight in particular requiring players to restart the game if they build Ramza in an incorrect way and save at just the wrong moment. These days, it's thought of as more of a cult classic, the perfect expression of a niche genre, but not something that would ever appeal to mainstream gamers or tempt in those that weren't already interested. The thing is, these opinions would take years to ferment, and in the mid-1990s, Final Fantasy Tactics was simply seen as another top-notch release from a company and director that were quickly taking over the industry. So with Sakaguchi's desire for a strategy RPG finally satisfied, and Matsuno and the boys from Quest established as a major division within Squaresoft, the obvious question was where they went next. Well, the answer is the main course of this video, Yasumi Matsuno's masterpiece and the last game he would ever see to completion, Vagrant Story. During the development of Final Fantasy Tactics, Sakaguchi had been very impressed by Matsuno's management skills, and this proved to be rather timely, as thanks to the impending release of Square's first movie, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, he needed directors that he could trust to produce quality games without his input. After Matsuno's impressive work just months after joining the company, Sakaguchi felt confident that his team could be left to their own devices. So a meeting was called, and Matsuno and the key developers from Final Fantasy Tactics got together to hash out their next adventure. Very quickly it became clear that the idea of making Final Fantasy Tactics 2 didn't really appeal to anyone, and instead it was decided that they should create something entirely new, and entirely 3D. Now, it's not hard to imagine that it was Yasumi Matsuno driving this direction, and in an interview called From the Development Team, which Square released during Vagrant Story's marketing, he explained his thought process in a little more detail. To him, the idea of constantly reusing characters and endlessly producing similar sequels was utterly abhorrent, and he felt that it showed a disrespect for the artistic potential of video games. They were strong words, but Matsuno went even further when describing his vision for Vagrant Story. He claimed it would both appeal to hardcore system-driven gamers, but would also have the cinematic accessibility of a movie. It would be a game that defied characterization, leaping between genres and styles, and born out of what he called spontaneous, natural development. The vision of a team creating for the love of the medium, rather than to satisfy marketers or to hit sales goals. He capped everything off with a metaphor that takes us back to that night at the Shibuya Parthenon. if Final Fantasy is a Hollywood blockbuster, Vagrant Story is an artistic, independent movie, to be watched in a small theatre and truly remembered. It's quite the interview for a director to give, coming across as a mixture of confrontational and arrogant, but also profoundly ambitious, and frankly giving out well-deserved criticism to an industry that was already starting to trend towards shameless mass appeal. If it had been anyone else, you might assume this to be the pride before the fall, but remember, this was a man who Hideo Kojima said could save the industry. And sitting behind his soaring ambition was a team of profoundly talented developers more than happy to follow him into battle. Once again, the X-Quest team took on most of the major development roles, with Matsuno writing, directing and designing, Sakamoto composing the music, and the duo of Minagawa and Yoshida responsible for the art design and graphical presentation. To augment this core team, both Yun Akiyama and Taru Murata, who had both worked on Final Fantasy Tactics, were promoted to lead planner and lead programmer, and armed with a team of around 50 staff, development began in 1997 and wouldn't conclude for another 3 years. By 1990s video game standards, this was a monstrously long development cycle, and probably invites images of a messy and confused process. Rather surprisingly, the reality was quite the opposite, and each team made steady progress, working together in a cohesive manner, all under the eagle eye of Yasumi Matsuno. Interestingly, much of the process was documented in the Vagrant Story Ultimania guidebook, which Square published alongside the game's release in Japan, and thanks to the hard work of the guys at shmuplations.com, we English speakers can also peer into this world. Rather expectedly, the translation to 3D proved to be the biggest hurdle, especially as the team only had limited experience with modelling and animations. But oddly, lead designer Hiroshi Minagawa considered this to be an advantage. He felt that the team's history with 2D development meant that they were really adept at being creative within restrictions. And so the whole process turned into this sort of puzzle where they constantly tried to find clever ways to resolve issues and achieve their goals. For example, Matsuno insisted that all character models needed to have multiple facial expressions, but very quickly Minagawa realised that this was simply impossible. By opting against pre-rendered backgrounds and going for fully 3D environments, they only had around 300 polygons per character to work with, and this meant no moving lips or eyes. Anyone else would have given up, but instead Minagawa's crew worked out an ingenious way of quickly loading different textures to paint expressions onto the characters' faces. Obviously this had to be carefully lined up with cutscene direction, but the effect ended up looking far more stylish than if they'd gone the traditional route. Similarly, the team decided early on that they absolutely couldn't ship with lengthy load times, and so Taku Murata had to come up with a way of stitching the gameplay and cutscenes and effects together without causing masses of slowdown. Again, this would typically just be impossible, but instead of accepting defeat, he spent 3 entire years placing hundreds of tiny loads within the game, hidden away in room transitions or behind dialogue or taking place under short cutscenes. This method of hiding loading is something that's now standard practice, but for the late 90s it was highly innovative and gives Vagrant Story a speed and flow that most other 90s RPGs can't even come close to matching. Rather sadly, this was hardly acknowledged in the game's reviews, and in his Ultimania interview, Taku Murata admits that had he known how little credit he would receive, he probably wouldn't have bothered and would have just stuck to traditional loading screens. Instead, all the magazine headlines were dominated by the writing and direction of Yasumi Matsuno. And while we'll dive into both of these aspects in far greater detail later in the video, they both had a big influence on how Vagrant Story was made. Firstly, it was decided almost immediately that the team would completely avoid using CGI cutscenes, and outside of a single promotional trailer, the entire story, from the moment you load the disc to the final scroll of the credits, takes place in-engine. For a Squaresoft PS1 game, this was virtually unheard of. They'd built their entire 3D reputation on their groundbreaking use of CGI, to the point where Sakaguchi was literally making an animated movie. So for Matsuno and co to break from this formula would have taken supreme confidence in an alternative. Well, to nobody's surprise, that was exactly what Matsuno believed he had. According to Yun Akiyama, they spent countless hours studying movies, closely watching how directors used camera angles and then tried to apply these ideas to how they presented their own narrative. Rather than structuring the game around just a handful of eye-catching FMVs, Vagrant Story is instead littered with countless dialogue-driven scenes that took up almost as much development time as the actual gameplay. In order to facilitate all the sweeping camera work, every 3D model had to be visible from every angle, which took an enormous amount of time to build, and most curiously, Matsuno requested that the soundtrack progress in tandem with the player's progression through the dialogue. It meant that Sakamoto had to compose strange tracks that could loop in place, but would still augment the drama like a traditional film score. When you take all this into consideration, it's absolutely no surprise that the development cycle ended up taking as long as it did, and apparently it could have gone on even longer. Late in 1999, it became clear that they would need to release soon, or risk running out of console lifecycle, as the PlayStation 2 was due out in March 2000. This led to Matsuno's ambition finally having to be curbed, and everything that was remotely unfinished, like local multiplayer, AI-controlled companions, and a host of extra cutscenes, all had to be left behind as the team raced to hit its deadline. Well, they did indeed make it, although only by the skin of their teeth, as Vagrant Story released in Japan a mere 22 days before the release of Sony's next-generation console. This could have easily overshadowed the team's hard work, but their game quickly made waves on both sides of the Pacific thanks to its extremely impressive critical reception. In the West, magazines like EGM, GamePro, and Official PlayStation Magazine couldn't have been more positive, and this sentiment was shared by emerging influential websites, with IGN reviewer David Zadryko stating that it was not only one of the best games of the year, but one of the greatest games ever made. It was gushing praise, but the real jewel in Vagrant Story's review crown came from Japan. Back in the 1990s, the arbiter of all that was quality in the Japanese video game world was the magazine Famitsu and its notorious 40 scale mark. Now, they were miserly in the extreme, priding themselves on only handing out high scores to the best of the best. Seminal titles like A Link to the Past, Super Mario 64 and Tekken 3 all fell short with 39 out of 40, and huge blockbusters like Final Fantasy VII and Resident Evil could only manage a 38. In fact, by the year 2000, in the 14 years since Famitsu began, they had only handed out 2 perfect scores, one to Ocarina of Time in 1998, and another a year later to Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast. This infamous review austerity only made it all the more incredible when news emerged that they had awarded their 3rd ever perfect score to Vagrant Story, an accolade that sent reverberations around the world and made sure that the title would go down in history. It was impossible to see the release as anything other than a major triumph, and it seemed that Kojima's predictions about Matsuno had come true. He really had saved the industry by placing ambition and creativity above all else. This is why it's all the more shocking that just 5 years later, Yasumi Matsuno had not only left Square, but quit the video game industry altogether, and Vagrant Story, his cinematic masterpiece and Squaresoft's first Famitsu perfect score, had been entirely forgotten in the wake of a new generation. To understand how this could happen, we've got to dive into the game itself. Firstly, to see why its flame burnt so bright, and then to work out how it could flicker away within a matter of years. The clues to the fate of our creator lie within his creation. So guard yourself against the dark as we step into the dead city of Lea Monde, a world where memory, life, and death bleed into one. From its very first moments, it's obvious that Vagrant Story is an RPG like none other, and Matsuno's unique approach to video game design makes for one of the most captivating opening sequences in the history of the medium. You see, Japanese role-playing games in the 1990s were typically slow starters, and thanks to the long run times and focus on extensive world building, most directors liked to take their time, easing players in with sleepy rural villages and menial chores. By the year 2000, this structure was essentially genre doctrine, and things had started to get out of hand, with the average runtime of a console RPG massively increasing, and taking with it the amount of time it took to get to the good stuff. The poster child for this was Dragon Quest VII, a truly gigantic game that asked the player to sit through almost 5 hours before the very first fight. And it was this trend that Matsuno was looking to buck when directing the opening of Vagrant Story. Rather than taking cues from other video games, he turned to the world of cinema and put together a series of scenes that have more in common with Mission Impossible than Secret of Mana, immediately catching your attention and drawing you into a world of conspiracy, betrayal, and mystery. When you select a new game, the very first image you see is the stately home of Duke Bardorba, burning against the night sky. Clearly we're headed straight into the action, and the very next scene is a beautiful sequence of shots which frame a blonde knight drawing his sword from a corpse and then staring out across the burning citadel while a soldier makes a panicked report. Despite the fires that threaten to engulf the manor, the blonde knight is far more concerned with the location of one Sydney. And with just a single name, Vagrant Story's atmosphere of mystery is established. Who are these characters? What's happening within the manor? And most importantly, who is Sydney? While this initial narrative hook is beautifully simple, the graphical presentation is anything but, and those hours spent studying camera work and perfecting the models have clearly paid off. In this short scene alone, we have texture work that simulates shadows, clever camera angles that show the manor burning without the need for complex animations, and some of the most gorgeous text bubbles that I've ever seen. It inarguably looks and sounds premium, and that's also found in how the credits are woven into this sequence. Not only does it work as an effective scene transition, but seeing the developers' names positioned so prominently gives everything a real sense of gravity, almost like you're watching a summer blockbuster rather than playing a PlayStation 1 RPG. So with the next screen wipe, we're taken to the manor's courtyard, and as rain begins to fall, a lone man stares up at the burning building. This is Ashley Riot, Vagrant Story's protagonist, although just like with the Blonde Knight, we're offered little clue as to who he is and why he's here. Really, you'd only know he's the main character thanks to his prominence on the game's cover. Once inside, he hides away and watches as the interlopers decide to kill their hostages, which prompts the camera to pull back and for Vagrant Story, the video game, to suddenly roar into life. Now functionally this is nothing more than a basic battle to introduce the player to the game's mechanics, but its place in this opening sequence makes it feel far more consequential than the average tutorial. We're not just learning how to attack and defend, but preventing the deaths of the hostages. A beautiful marriage of the interactivity of video games and the immersion of cinema. With our victory comes another scene change. Ashley is now inside of the manor, where he's located the perpetrator, the aforementioned Sydney, who's currently embroiled in an argument with his second in command, Hardin. Once again, the presentation is just leagues beyond what you'd expect from a 5th generation title. Instead of immediately showing Sydney, the scene slowly builds to his reveal, focusing on Ashley's reactions while he eavesdrops, and even obscuring the villain's face when the camera does move inside the throne room. When we finally do see Sydney, one question is answered, but another is posed. How has such a diminutive and slender man, wearing no armour and carrying no weapons, caused all the chaos raging within the manor? And why are his subordinates so terrified of his wrath? Again, the credits cut across the scene and we jump forwards in time. Ashley has burst into the room and holds Sydney at gunpoint, demanding he stand down and submit to being captured. It's a standoff that lasts mere minutes, as without warning, Sydney rushes at Ashley, only to be shot through the heart. The soldier then stands over his quarry confirming his kill, but is interrupted by Hardin returning with a young hostage, which proves to be just enough of a distraction for Ashley to be caught in the back of the head, by none other than Sydney. He again stands tall, but this time with a bolt protruding from his chest, and in what is clearly meant to be wheezing and broken speech, he orders Hardin to take the boy to Lea Monde. Ashley can't believe what's happening and demands answers, but as Sydney pulls the arrow from his body, all he offers is this fantastic line: "Show a little more respect for fairy tales, risk breaker." With that, he calls down a wyvern who smashes through the ceiling to stand in Ashley's way, and whether he be a demon or magician or mere mortal, the wounded Sydney escapes out of a stained glass window and leaves the risk-breaker to his fate. This leads into a second section of gameplay where we battle with the lizard and are introduced to some further mechanics, but really this fight is meant to provide a narrative climax. The boss fight might be a design trope as old as time, but it's certainly effective at giving a sequence closure, and it rounds out the introduction with a moment of victory, a taste of success that beckons the player into the rest of the game. When the beast is felled, Ashley heads up to the smashed window, but there's no sign of Sydney. Only the smoking remains of the Duke's estate, bathed in the morning glow of the rising sun. Our final line of dialogue is the mystery at the heart of Vagrant Story. A name and a question. Lea Monde. What did Sydney mean by Lea Monde? With that, the camera pulls back inside the throne room, and as the music swells and the lens flare frames our hero looking out across the horizon, the screen cuts to the title, and Vagrant Story begins. The whole sequence is a mere 10 minutes long, establishing its characters, gameplay, central plot and cinematic style with such masterful skill that you can hardly believe this was the team's first foray into the world of 3D development. I honestly believe that if you consider the hardware being used and the state of video game storytelling when it was created, this is probably the greatest introductory sequence ever put to disc. And if you aren't desperate to discover what happens next, well, I simply think storytelling isn't for you. Now, before we dive into the game proper, we have to discuss the first of what will be many strange design choices. There's actually a lot more to Vagrant Story's introduction than this exciting piece of video game cinema. For some reason, there is a very important additional context contained within 2 other cutscenes, but if you just start a new game, you'll never see them. That is because they will only play if you set the controller down and just wait on the main menu. Eventually the game's CGI trailer will begin, and then after another 30-second wait, you're shown an abridged version of the events at Duke Bardorba's manor, but this time with a police report spliced in between its scenes, and this reveals a critical piece of information. These text cards claim that not only is Ashley Riot missing after his encounter with Sydney, but he stands accused of killing Duke Bardorba, an event that can only have happened before or after the events that we witnessed. Now, it's quite perplexing that something so major would be hidden away, but things get even more absurd. If you again wait after this cutscene ends, a third sequence will begin, and this one is even more fundamental to the plot, effectively acting as a sister sequence to the game's introduction and containing all manner of important world building. Everything opens with a watercolour style vista, but this time we're looking at the headquarters of the VKP, the Valendian Knights of Peace, a secret police force tasked with protecting the realm from the most deadly of threats. Inside we find a darkened room where 3 figures discuss the current state of the kingdom, and from their conversation we discover quite a bit about the characters that we've just been introduced to. It seems that Sydney, whose full name is Sydney Losserot, is the leader of a heretical cult called Mullenkamp, and the objective of their raid was to secure the release of imprisoned cultists and force the abdication of Cardinal Bertistum, the leader of Valendia's Church of Iocus and an important political figure. It's a story that the VKP don't believe, as their spies have uncovered a connection between Sydney and the Duke, namely that the noble has been secretly funding Mullenkamp, meaning some sort of disagreement or betrayal must have taken place. It's a confusing situation made all the more complex by the involvement of the Crimson Blades, a private militia who directly serve the church, and who we can presume are the knights that we saw at the very start of the game. Their presence at the manor was apparently unsanctioned, and the VKP leadership bemoan Valendia's freedom of religion, which is allowing cults and the church to run roughshod over the state. From this conference, it's clear that Valendia is a deeply divided nation, and while the VKP are ostensibly allied with the country's parliament, they refer to it with scorn and clearly see themselves as the true power holding everything together. Now, while this scene has much more of a traditional JRPG world-building purpose, it's still presented with Matsuno's customary style, and again it wouldn't look out of place in a Hollywood spy thriller. Little touches like the smoke rising from the Inquisitor's cigarette, or the way that flashes of lightning reveal crowded silhouettes in the background, all contribute to the scene's murky atmosphere, and they wordlessly flesh out the information we're given. The VKP are the power in the shadows, not just because of what we're told, but because of how they operate, and this will be an important theme that runs throughout the rest of the game. So with the board set, Ashley Riot, the VKP's foremost risk breaker, a sort of one-man commando unit that undertakes impossible missions, is finally relayed his orders. He is to head to Duke Bardorba's manor and rendezvous with fellow VKP agent Callo Malose, and then the two are to rescue the hostages, investigate the Crimson Blades, and most importantly, arrest Sydney Losseron. We then cut across to the Duke's manor as Ashley meets with Malose. Very quickly it becomes clear that he is a cold and detached individual, caring nothing for pleasantries, immediately demanding a field report and barely averting his stare from the building that houses his target. Once the manor catches fire, he moves to head inside, and in response to Callo's protests that it's far too dangerous and that they should wait for reinforcements, the risk breaker looks back and simply replies, "I am the reinforcements." Now you might be wondering why these two sequences were split up, as both are basically mandatory in order to fully understand Vagrant Story's narrative, and as we've just seen, one directly leads into the other. Well, there's never been any confirmation, but personally, I believe it's nothing more than a matter of editing. Would that hyper-engaging opening sequence pack as much punch if you had to sit through 5 minutes of complex world building beforehand? Maybe it wouldn't make a difference, but Matsuno clearly thought otherwise. And by making this additional context optional viewing, he's signalling that this is going to be a tightly paced story, the antithesis of the bloated RPG runtimes that he was desperate to rebel against. The issue is really that it's just so hidden away, and had there been an option on the main menu called something like Mission Briefing, this creative decision might have worked slightly better. Now, immediately after you've watched both of these cutscenes, we're still not quite ready to dive into the meat of the game, as there are a couple more moments of intrigue before we take control of Ashley. Much like how the opening credits were used, these next few scenes are spliced up with excerpts from two pieces of in-world text. The first being a quote by the historian A.J. Durai, and the second, snippets from the VKP Greylands Incident Report. Durai's writing refers to spiritual philosophy, and how he believes that our bodies are mere vessels for the selfish and vicious souls that they house. It's certainly flavoursome, but even after making this video, I've always struggled to understand how it relates to the plot, beyond establishing that, in Valendia, people believe that the body and soul are two separate entities. Now, the Greylands report is more obviously connected, but before we see that, we're introduced to another set of characters and another faction in this grand drama. Resting in his chambers after a serious bout of illness is Duke Bardorba, who miraculously avoided the attack on his home thanks to a stay at his secondary residence. In spite of his sickness, he's being brought up to date by a loyal knight called Jan Rosenkrantz. And through this scene we learn not only that the blonde knight is Guildenstern, leader of the Crimson Blades, but that the Duke and Mullenkamp are in fact connected, as the VKP suspect. Clearly Bardorba is a steely and dominating man, and from his bed he orders his footmen to torch any evidence connecting himself to the cult, and commands Rosenkrantz to hunt down Sydney, telling him that Lea Monde is yours. His only requirement is that his son Joshua, the child that we saw Hardin and Sydney abducting, is returned unharmed. And for just a moment his stony exterior melts away, and he whispers that the child is his light and his soul. As Rosenkrantz leaves, the camera lingers and focuses on a painting directly opposite the Duke's bed. It is his family, and right in the centre, his beloved son. So with the Duke's faction established, we finally return to Ashley and Malose, who have tracked Sydney and Mullenkamp to the ancient city of Lea Monde, where they discover that its guards have been slaughtered and their quarry has fled into its ruined halls. Through more on-screen excerpts, we learned that Lea Monde was once a mighty centre of civilization, renowned for its martial strength and religious zeal, but 25 years ago it was brought low by a devastating natural disaster, which rendered the entire city uninhabitable. It is now a necropolis, accessible only by this lone passageway, and considered a death sentence for any who had set foot inside. Malose claims that the VKP have sent agents there before, but none have ever returned. Right on cue, our attention shifts to the Greylands report, which was clearly written after the events of the game, and it seems that Lea Monde's reputation is well deserved. The report states that after the attack on the Duke's manor, Ashley Riot pursued Sydney Losserot into the City of the Dead and was never seen again. Our final scene is Ashley doing just this. Regardless of the danger, he intends to head into Lea Monde and tells Melose that she should stay behind, as her inexperience will simply slow him down. All he asks is that she brief him about who or what Sydney actually is, and here we get our first insight into Vagrant Story's enigmatic antagonist. According to Melose, he's a self-styled apocalyptic prophet, and his heretical teachings have earned him both a legion of cult-like followers and the ire of the church, which is why the Crimson Blades are so keen to arrest him. Similarly, the VKP has been tracking him because of his shadowy connections to Bar Dorba, although this is less to do with religion and more because the secret police want to wrestle power away from the Duke and increase their own influence over Parliament. The truth of his motivations and allegiances remains a mystery, but Melose warns Ashley that there is one thing he can be certain of. The leader of Mullenkamp wields dark and strange powers. He can read the hearts of men, compel them to obey his orders, and as we've already witnessed, he seemingly cannot be killed. Ashley remains unconvinced, and having heard enough, he slams the gate of the passageway behind him and leaves Agent Melose to return to headquarters. Only, as she makes to leave Lea Monde, she comes face to face with the Dark Prophet himself, and as a smile spreads across Sydney's face, the scene fades to the final few pages of the Greylands report, and Vagrant Story finally begins in earnest. Now, within the context of this video, this all probably seems like a lot to digest and quite a complex way to begin your game. Within just 15 minutes, we're introduced to a large cast of characters, lots of conflicting factions, and a host of locations and concepts which most other games would spend hours gently drip-feeding to the player. Instead, Vagrant Story throws us right into the action, asking us not to stop and ponder every single line of dialogue, but to be swept up in its mysteries, prioritising immersion and immediacy over the slow burn. Matsuno had said that Vagrant Story would be less like a video game and more like a movie thriller, and you've got to say that judging by the game's opening moments, it certainly seems that his team had backed up his extraordinary claims. Whether it's watched on a tiny CRT, a 40-inch widescreen, on a monitor on your desk, or from the palm of your hand, the effect is always the same. Much like Ashley Riot, we cannot help but be drawn into the world of Lea Monde, and the unparalleled writing and direction are everything to do with why this always works. So, with the story established, we finally take control of Ashley in the Lea Monde wine cellar, and it's here that Vagrant Story begins to flex its muscles as an actual video game. Now, given the sheer cinematic ambition of the opening cutscenes, you'd be forgiven for expecting gameplay that does the same, either with pulse-pounding action like in Metal Gear Solid or Tomb Raider, or by aping the maximalist RPG systems of Final Fantasy or Parasite Eve. Well, Matsuno opted for neither, and at its core, Vagrant Story is a rather traditional dungeon crawler. Every moment of gameplay takes place inside the walls of Lea Monde. We only control Ashley rather than a large party of characters, and there are no towns or NPCs to act as sanctuary from the hordes of beasts and demons that you have to overcome. In this respect, it's somewhat similar to From Software's Kingsfield, or Looking Glass Studios' Ultima Underworld, although here Matsuno and his team present everything from a third-person perspective, which helps maintain the veneer of a Japanese role-playing game. Now, obviously this is a major departure from the team's previous projects, and oddly enough, amidst all the interviews and developer testimony, there's virtually no information available to explain this shift in style. All we have to go on is an interview where Matsuno explained that he was particularly sensitive to player feedback, and with each new release he would try to directly address the elements that he felt people hadn't enjoyed. So, looking back to Final Fantasy Tactics, we can only presume that there were complaints around not being able to move freely between the world and battle, and having to micromanage multiple characters, which in tandem with Vagrant Story's smaller scale narrative, you can sort of see naturally leading them to a third-person dungeon crawler. Regardless of the reasons for this pivot, it's meant that Vagrant Story is quite the unique experience, taking ideas from all corners of the RPG world and forming something that is extremely distinct from the rest of Squaresoft's catalogue. So how does it all work? Well, you control Ashley in real time, moving him around with the left control pad and rotating the camera with the L2 and R2 buttons, which let you examine Lea Monde's various rooms from all angles. Just like with the character models, Taku Murata's team spent countless hours texturing every environmental polygon, and it means that not only does everything look great from the game's pseudo-isometric perspective, but it allows for a seamless first-person mode without any loss of fidelity. Now this is important not just for the game's sense of immersion, but also for its level design, as Vagrant Story has a surprising amount of verticality. On the square button is a pretty large jump, and throughout your time in Lea Monde, you'll find Ashley needing to leap over chasms, pull himself up ledges, and use the first-person mode in order to work out where to go next. That being said, Tomb Raider this is not, and broadly speaking, the many rooms you visit are simple affairs. You open the door, walk in, and engage in life or death combat against a wide variety of Lea Mondean monsters. This is done by pressing the circle button, which switches Ashley into battle mode and readies whatever weapons or shields you have equipped. Another press of the circle button brings up a wireframe sphere, which acts as your rangefinder and allows you to pick a target to attack. Now this will probably conjure images of another third-person wireframe aiming action RPG, Parasite Eve, but after just a few battles it becomes clear that Aya Brea and Ashley Riot do things pretty differently. While Parasite Eve was built around an ATB system, and battles had you constantly dodging enemy attacks, Vagrant Story is much more focused on complex one-on-one duels. There's nowhere near as much movement, and instead the flow of battle revolves around trying to find the right kind of strike to get inside your opponent's defences and deal heavy damage. When an enemy comes inside your weapon's range, you don't just target them, but one of their body parts, and that gives you a lot to think about as each target has its own accuracy rating, its own health pool, and debuffs that activate if they are destroyed. For example, if you're facing a powerful spellcaster, even though you have a higher chance of hitting its body, you'll want to target its head, as with just a few strikes you can break it, which prevents it from casting any more spells. Likewise, if you're facing an enemy that moves around a lot, you'll want to target its legs, as breaking them inflicts a 50% movement debuff, and the same applies to every other body part, with the right arm governing attacks, the left arm parries, and the body increasing their risk, which is something I'll explain in just a moment. Interestingly, this all also applies to Ashley, and in the bottom left of the screen is a little graphic that shows the state of his body, with the exact same debuffs being triggered by taking too much damage to the corresponding part. In combination with regular enemies having quite large health pools, this system means you're not just trying to pump out as many attacks as you can, but carefully assessing the situation and picking your strikes to maximise your damage. Now while this is all very interesting, you'll notice it doesn't equate to a great deal of interactivity, which brings us on to Risk, a unique mechanic that has its roots in a startling narrative development. As Ashley continues into the depths of Lea Monde, it becomes quickly evident that all is not well with our risk breaker, and he begins to experience visions and hallucinations. In one room, the screen flashes white, and he suddenly finds himself in a lush green meadow under brilliant blue skies. Ahead of him is a single tree, and in its shade rests a family's picnic, where a young boy stands and calls out to him, "Papa." The vision ends, but back in the depths of Lea Monde, Ashley can still see the child, with the colour drained from its body. A ghostly apparition which beckons him deeper into the labyrinth. Real or imagined, Ashley decides to follow, and this path leads him into confrontation with the game's first boss, the Minotaur, which is not all that complex, as its head is its weakest location, and by attacking this, you can disable its Giga Rush attack, which renders it somewhat incapable of doing any proper damage. Instead, the interest comes from what happens afterwards, as just as Ashley makes to leave, he is frozen in place by the voice of Sydney Losserot. Somehow the Dark Prophet has magicked himself into the room and appears utterly unthreatened by the Riskbreaker, toying with him and pondering the state of our protagonist's soul. For anyone else it would be a moment of speculation, but Sydney is no mere man, and in another demonstration of his power, he reaches inside of Ashley to read the inner workings of his heart. Here we're returned to that summer vision, and symbolised by his grey model, Ashley looks deeper and realises what he is witnessing. These are his final moments with his family, a wife and son, Tia and Marco. Against this backdrop of smiles and laughter, the scene is shattered as both are killed by bandits, and with his heart pounding in his ears, Ashley is thrown back to Lea Monde. Sydney taunts that his inability to protect Tia and Marco was as good as murdering them himself, and when Ashley lashes out, the Prophet reveals that his failure also extends to his work as an agent, as they have captured his comrade Callo Malose. From across the room, Sydney leaves us with a final vicious goad, telling Ashley to look inside of himself and discover the truth, and to give chase as the hunter does to the heart. With this, he disappears into the shadows, but before Ashley can turn and deal with Hardin, his body is racked with pain as another set of memories floods into his mind. Clearly, seeing Tia and Marco has unlocked something deep within him, and this has a direct consequence on the gameplay, as we're told that Ashley has uncovered new battle abilities from within his suppressed memory. This is the chain system, which is how Vagrant Story keeps its combat interesting after you've worked out the optimum location to attack. Basically, you can assign a special move to the square, triangle or circle buttons, and once Ashley lands an attack, you can chain these moves by hitting the corresponding button when an exclamation mark appears over his head. Different moves have different timing windows, and there's actually quite a knack to linking these together, which you'll want to quickly get good at as there's no limit to how many chains you can execute, which makes them an extremely powerful tool. Obviously there are chain attacks that add additional damage, but many of them are quite a bit more functional, offering heals or weapon repairs or inflicting status ailments, and just like with the targeting, you have to think about which you have assigned and how they relate to each battle you find yourself in. Now, if you get good enough at the timings, there's nothing stopping you from doing a 30-hit combo and killing every single enemy in a single blow, and this is where risk comes into the equation. Under Ashley's health bar is the risk meter, and every chain ability adds a certain amount of risk, which severely weakens Ashley once it reaches certain thresholds. As it builds up, your chance to successfully land attacks decreases, and most importantly, if it hits 100, your defences are cut in half, which in the middle of a boss fight is an almost guaranteed game over. As the bar can only be reduced by using certain items or by exiting combat, it's something you have to be constantly aware of, and it effectively acts as a stamina bar, punishing players that mindlessly chain attacks and aren't thoughtful about what they're doing and why. Now, there are also chain abilities for when you're on the defense, and these are just as important. Much like your offensive moves, you assign these to the same buttons, and by hitting them just as an enemy attacks, you execute a sort of magical parry that can be set to do all manner of things. You can reflect damage, raise elemental defenses, restore magic, and most importantly, halve incoming physical and magical damage. As Ashley has a relatively small health pool, getting this timing down is absolutely critical, and it'll often be the difference between victory and failure. Between the targeting system and the offensive and defensive chain abilities, you can see how very quickly Vagrant Story becomes a much more involved and complex experience, and this is without even touching on how the magic works. Almost as soon as he arrives in the wine cellar, Ashley overhears the rearguards of the Crimson Blade discussing their mission and the fantastical things they've seen from just a short amount of time within the Dead City. Turns out their mission is not just to apprehend Sydney, but to acquire the miracles of Lea Monde, magical spells that are contained within grimoires. These are ancient books which bestow upon the reader unnatural abilities, and from the conversation between the blades, it's clear that even the lowest squire could draw power from them. Unsurprisingly, it doesn't take long for Ashley to stumble across a few himself, and much like advertised, by using them as you would a healing potion or status cure, he learns the spell they represent and then can use it at any time. It probably sounds like a lot to take in, but over the course of your time in the wine cellar and then the sanctum which follows it, all of these systems and concepts are drip fed to you, slowly layering on top of each other until they become second nature. By the time we arrive at the end of the sanctum and come face to face with a monstrous dragon that's guarding the stairway to the rest of Lea Monde, you'll be flying through combat, and it means you can start to appreciate the strategy and tension that this odd battle system creates. Against the Dragon Guardian, positioning is incredibly important, as its weak spots are found on both its neck and tail, but if you're caught in front while trying to get into place, it'll unleash an extremely powerful fire breath attack. On top of this lethal dance, we've by now found a few grimoires, namely the ability to heal and 2 spells that buff Ashley's equipment and lower your opponent's strength. They both make a huge difference to the amount of damage you can do, but are very mana intensive, which means you'll need to land chain attacks in order to refill your MP, but not so many that you push up your risk and can't land a single blow. It's certainly complex, but it makes for a captivating fight, and tickles those brain receptors that love to see damage numbers going up and big monsters being felled. By this point you'll have probably been playing for maybe 3 or 4 hours, and as Ashley opens the pathway up to the surface and sunlight falls across his face, it's easy to think that you're beginning to get the hang of Vagrant Story systems. But brother, let me tell you, we haven't seen anything yet. So with the wine cellar and sanctum behind him, Ashley arrives in Lea Monde's town centre, and despite the city's reputation, he finds it teeming with life, currently occupied by an exhausted battalion of Crimson Blades. Lurking in the shadows, the Riskbreaker manages to overhear quite a bit, and learns that the soldiers of the church are taking heavy losses, and are making little progress in their hunt, with the cultists that they manage to capture refusing to give up any information about their prophet. It's here we also learn more about the Crimson Blades leader, Romeo Guildenstern, who, accompanied by his lover Samantha, reveals that the church are far more aware of Lea Monde's power than the VKP were aware of. Supposedly, the magical energies that flow through the city are called the Dark, and if you remain in their embrace for too long, you suffer something Guildenstern calls an incomplete death, the separation of your soul and body, and the cause of the shambling horrors which Ashley had fought to get here. Terrified of this idea, Samantha pleads with her lover to protect them from this fate, and in response, Guildenstern tells her that they are here to do just that, as they have orders from the Cardinal to discover the secret of Sydney's immortality. From across the river, Ashley hears everything, but before he can ponder how this connects with his own orders, he's discovered and is attacked by Father Duane and his 2 bodyguards. Now, up until this point, Vagrant Story has not really been too challenging. Sure, there's a lot of systems to learn and different combat mechanics to wrap your head around, but it's nothing that a seasoned RPG player will find too confronting. That is, until you face Father Duane. When I reached this point, I had my process nicely laid out. I made sure to cast Prostasia on Ashley's equipment, debuffed his bodyguards, and tried to balance putting damage onto them while healing through Duane's extremely potent magical spells. The 2 knights fell without much issue, but when I came to strike down their leader, I made a horrible discovery. None of my weapons did any damage. The numbers were the same no matter what I equipped. Somewhat decent chance to hit, but a predicted damage of 0 on every single body part. I was so confused, and with Duane pumping out over 100 damage with each spell, I barely had time to think before Ashley slumped to the floor and I hit an unexpected game over. Clearly thinking I'd missed something obvious, I reloaded and charged back into battle, but the outcome was exactly the same. Couldn't do any damage, and it didn't matter what weapons I used, what chains I set, or what spells I cast. Duane was impervious to every tool in my arsenal. Well, as it turns out, I didn't understand nearly as much as I thought, and there are a whole host of other systems that we need to discuss if I'm going to paint a full picture of what it's like to play Vagrant Story. At the core of my Duane problem is how your weapons work, and there are a lot more to consider than whatever has the highest strength rating. You see, weapons in Vagrant Story are split into 3 different categories: edged, which relates to swords, daggers and axes; piercing, which covers rapiers, spears and crossbows; and blunt, which is hammers and maces. The idea is that every single enemy you face is weak to one of these 3 types, and instead of just sticking to whatever you feel comfortable with, you're supposed to maintain a wide arsenal of options that you constantly switch between. Another grimoire you find early on contains the spell Analyze, and whenever you encounter a new foe, you're supposed to assess them, discover which type they're weak to, and then incorporate that information into your battle plan, along with the spells, chains and body part targeting. Now this isn't too hard to understand when it's laid out in front of you, but thanks to a few other mechanics, the first few areas of Vagrant Story can tempt you away from this process and send you down a dead end. The weapon you begin the game with is an edged sword called the Fandango, and thankfully almost everything in the wine cellar is weak to edged, which means you can slash away without having to do any forward planning. This constant use builds up something called phantom points, which are found in the weapon status screen next to another bar which measures its condition. These PP points have two uses. Firstly, they can be cashed in to repair a broken weapon, but more importantly, they act as a damage multiplier, and at 100 out of 100 PP, all weapons do substantially more damage. This means that if you stick exclusively to using the Fandango, it'll become quite the powerful early game weapon, and can more than cover up for any damage loss incurred by not switching weapons to capitalise on enemy type weaknesses. So this is something of a serious trap, as by the time you reach the Lea Monde town centre, you'll only have one strong weapon, as nothing else you found will have any phantom points. So surely this is the explanation for my issues. Well, surprisingly it isn't, as Duane is actually weak to edged weapons, like the Fandango, which means something else must have been causing me to do zero damage. There is yet another system that we have to bear in mind, and this one might be the most obscure of the lot. On top of enemies being weak to one of three weapon classes, they also have an affinity and class rating. Let's start with class, which is effectively the kind of monster you're battling. We've got human, beast, undead, phantom, dragon, and evil, and the way it works is that the higher your number, the more damage you do to that type, and the lower, with the scale going into a minus, the less damage you do and the more you take. The same system applies to affinity, which is the elemental school they belong to, with the options being physical, air, earth, water, fire, light, and dark. Now this is where things get tricky, because the ratings of your weapons and armour in these classes can change, and for some reason it's all done without the game telling you. Basically, whenever you attack an enemy, your weapon absorbs some of its being. So if you attack a lot of beasts, you'll increase its effectiveness against beasts, or if you attack a lot of fire creatures, you'll improve its affinity with fire. To complicate things further, every class and affinity is in opposition to another, which means if you raise one, you'll be lowering another, once again preventing you from sticking to a single weapon and encouraging you to maintain a spread of options. Now the problem is that all of this is hidden by default, and you have to go into the main menu and turn on an option which alerts you to weapon status changes, which then appear in the bottom left of the screen and allow you to see how your gear is developing. This system is the true issue at the core of our Duane problem. You see, the Sanctum is full of undead enemies, which unsurprisingly raise your weapons rating against undead, but they also raise its light affinity. If, like me, you're foolishly sticking to the Fandango because it does the most damage, this will eventually have the effect of tipping its elemental affinity from physical to light. And surprise surprise, Father Duane has extremely high defences against light. So I might have felt like I understood Vagrant Story, but I was actually playing it completely wrong. And when I stepped into battle in the town centre, the weapon I'd been unknowingly developing was completely useless, and everything else had nowhere near enough phantom points to be able to outdamage the Crimson Blade Mage. After making this discovery, I instantly knew that there was only one way forward. I would have to start the game again. Now I'm sure for many people this would be more than enough reason to turn off for good, and frankly if this is your experience with Vagrant Story, I don't blame you for giving in to frustration. But the thing is, once you understand all of these systems, and learn how Matsuno and his team want you to engage with the gameplay, it transforms the experience into something quite unique. Earlier on I spoke about how, in contrast to most other 90s RPGs, we only control Ashley, but that doesn't mean Vagrant Story avoids party management. And really it wants you to think of your equipment as your team. In this respect, I think there's a clear evolutionary line between Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story. Instead of levelling up a white mage, a knight and an archer, you're levelling up a piercing weapon that's strong against the undead, a beast slayer edged weapon, or an elemental mace. And while the expression within the gameplay might be totally different, it's the very same process of managing a party and making sure they all progress in unity. So finally, with a full picture of how I should be approaching the game, I started over and went back through the wine cellar and Sanctum. this time making sure to harvest enough phantom points that each weapon I found could be used effectively in battle. On top of this, I began to craft my party by switching between weapons constantly, and pretty soon I had an edge sword that was strong against humans, an axe that was powerful against beasts, a rapier with a strong dragon rating, a silver dagger to use against the undead, and an all-purpose mace complete with a gem slot. By the time I got back to the town centre and dived into battle against my Crimson Blade nemesis, the difference was astounding, and with the damage finally flowing, I cut him down in seconds. This is the true face of Vagrant Story, a game that, above all else, asks you to be prepared. So with Duane defeated and Sydney still nowhere to be found, Ashley plunges deeper into Lea Monde. While our understanding of the game's systems might finally be in place, it's here that things begin to twist, as both the city and narrative unravel beneath our feet. So you might have realised that, so far, Vagrant Story has been pretty linear, and for all the cinematic storytelling and complex gameplay systems, the structure of this first section is remarkably traditional. While it's never presented like this, the wine cellar, sanctum and town centre are clearly designed to be levels 1, 2 and 3, and more typical dungeon crawler concepts like exploration and navigation don't really come into the equation. Now this was obviously done for two reasons. Firstly, in order to not overwhelm the player with options, and secondly, because it suits the narrative. At this point in the story, Ashley is hyper-focused on his mission, and with Calo Mallows in captivity, it would make sense for him to step away from the chase and begin wandering the halls of Lea Monde. That all being said, you can return to previous areas, and while there's little reason to do this, the next few zones begin to hint that this linear structure might not last all the way to the credits. The Lea Monde town centre is divided by a huge river, and as there's no way to cross and pursue Guildenstern, the only route we can follow is to take the Crimson Key dropped by Duane and head down into the abandoned mine. Now with us finally having a full understanding of Vagrant Story's gameplay, it becomes markedly easier, and as long as you religiously stick to the flow of buffing, debuffing and switching weapons, there's very little down here that can genuinely threaten you. Instead, the intrigue comes from the glimmers of non-linearity that begin to creep into the various dungeons. Here in the mine, eventually we reach a fork in the road, with one path leading to the zone's exit and the other to a locked door that requires the silver key, an item which we are yet to come across. Similarly, once we exit the mine and emerge on the other side of the town centre river, the first door we come to won't open unless we have something called the Ensanguined Rood. And obviously we don't have this, so we have to go looking elsewhere in order to find the path forward. Now I won't go as far as to say that Vagrant Story takes influence from Super Metroid or Symphony of the Night, as backtracking alone doesn't make a game a Metroidvania, but this is the same casual foreshadowing that those games use so masterfully in the design of their world. By showing you paths that you aren't able to take, you're constantly on the lookout for keys and magical sigils, and it gently brings exploration into the equation without ever overwhelming you with options. The very next zone, the Undercity, is the perfect example of this in practice, as it connects to no less than 5 other areas, but as most of the doors are sealed with various different keys that you don't have, during this visit you're still following the intended path, which takes you out into Snowfly Forest. Now this might seem like a lot of praise for what essentially amounts to nothing more than a series of locked doors, but I really feel like it has a genuine impact on how Lea Monde feels as both a gameplay space and a location within the story. It's supposed to be this sprawling and haunted necropolis, and by showing us shadowy pathways whose locks have somehow survived the city's fall, it probes our imagination, and suddenly Lea Monde becomes more than just the polygons we're shown on screen. In some ways, that promise of future non-linearity can be more tantalising than actually experiencing it, and the question of where these doors lead becomes another mystery, pushing us deeper into the game. Now while we're teased with changes to the wider structure, once we emerge from the Undercity, the way the individual levels are constructed takes a hard left turn, and from this point onwards, the direct A to B pathways of the wine cellar, sanctum and mines slip into the past. Snowfly Forest is a curious example, as it's both sprawling and claustrophobic, a strange quirk of Vagrant Story's engine which the development team have clearly stretched to its limits. It's easily the largest area in the game, featuring 26 unique rooms that are laid out in a complex non-linear manner that can take quite some getting used to. You see, the vast majority of the exits don't connect to the next room, instead teleporting you all over the map, which means the forest is more of a maze, asking you to constantly consult your map and carefully plot a path through the swirling mists and gnarled branches. In tandem with trees that are purposefully placed to obscure the camera, a handful of nasty encounters that feel like ambushes, and only a single save point tucked away in the south of the map, you'll very quickly find yourself desperately hunting for the exit, running past enemies and willfully taking damage to get out of this luscious but oppressive limbo. Considering that it's constructed from the very same building blocks as the rest of the game, it's extremely impressive that it's able to draw out an entirely different set of emotions, creating rushed and panicked gameplay that stands in stark contrast to the slow and purposeful combat that's defined everything else. On the other side of the forest, this pivot towards non-linearity continues as we emerge into the Lea Monde Keep, another crossroads full of locked doors, but interestingly, one that doesn't funnel us in a specific direction. Instead, when we emerge in the southern portion of the town centre, we're presented with a choice. You can either fight through a squad of Crimson Blades, climb a few rooftops and head into the Bandit's Hollow, or you can defeat a phantom lurking in one of the wings of the keep, take its Mandrake sigil and use this to unlock a path into the western portion of the Undercity. Both routes have completely different enemies, completely different bosses and entirely different loot, and there's absolutely no indication that either one of these paths is preferable to the other. My personal preference is to head into the Bandit's Hollow, as this area presents yet another interesting mix-up to the gameplay. At first glance it looks like another take on the abandoned mines, but as we push forward, something unexpected happens. There is a loud click and the game ominously informs us that somewhere a door has opened, which prompts a 2.5 minute timer to appear on the screen and for the music to switch to a pulse-pounding track that sounds like a fantasy cover of The Flight of the Bumblebee. It's not explicitly stated, but it's clear that the purpose is to find this door before the timer expires, a task which is rendered all the more challenging as the Bandit's Hollow is made up of 19 enemy-packed rooms that all interconnect much like the Snowfly Forest. With only 2.5 minutes, it seems virtually impossible, but Vagrant Story throws us a clever curveball, as the timer pauses during your actions, which means while casting spells, pulling off chains or switching items, you're not losing any time. This tiny little mechanic makes this whole sequence so fun to play through, as each room becomes its own little puzzle, asking you to work out the fastest way to progress, and making something as innocuous as a wrong turn feel like a punch to the gut. Do you spend precious seconds to cast healing magic or defensive buffs, or try to take out a pesky enemy with a single chain, knowing that a mistake will cost you precious time? It's a series of challenging decisions, and there's an even larger one baked into the structure of the level. The door to exit this zone isn't the only pathway that the timer unlocks, as in 2 locations there are optional chests that contain powerful gear, but you'll have to use up a lot of time if you want to get them. By the time I reached the final room and stood face to face with the boss of this area, the Earth Elemental, I had just 14 seconds to defeat the monster, and somehow, through exploiting its weaknesses and desperately hitting every single chain I could, I actually managed to do it. It was an incredible feeling, elation mixed with relief, mixed with sheer shock. And impressively, just like in the Snowfly Forest, it had all been conjured up with nothing more than the game's basic foundations and a short timer. For me, this is the mark of a seriously impressive gameplay system, that with just ever so slight tweaks, the developers can create all manner of unique situations and have the player reacting in totally different ways. There's so much complexity and depth to Vagrant Story's combat that they could have probably just focused entirely on that and still put out a really solid game. But that wasn't Matsuno's style, and this ambition to always be more is what makes his games so captivating. Now, you'll have likely noticed that so far I've had almost nothing bad to say, but here we arrive at the other side of the coin. With ambition comes experimentation, and with experimentation comes the potential to misfire, which Vagrant Story does pretty massively in one specific area. I am of course talking about its puzzles, or more specifically its box puzzles, as they are the only form of brain teaser to be found while exploring the ruins of Lea Monde. To be upfront, they don't work from a gameplay or narrative perspective, and may well be the worst part about this game. You first encounter them in the wine cellar, and at this early stage, they're not too offensive. All you have to do is push crates around in order to form a platform, so that Ashley can access a high ledge. And while it's no replacement for the combat or exploration, it's a serviceable little diversion. And it also makes sense within the game world. As we're in the wine cellar on the outskirts of the city, it tracks that there would be crates full of bottles waiting to be shipped out around Valendia. So seeing Ashley take advantage of this isn't as video gamey as it might first appear. The issue is that once we leave the wine cellar, the box puzzles continue, and dramatically increase in complexity with almost zero in-world explanation. With each area we visit, another mechanic is added to the system, and very quickly you're having to deal with boxes that flip over on their edges, boxes that can only be pushed a certain amount of times, boxes that slide along until they hit a wall, and you begin to get the picture. By the end of the game, they become ludicrously complicated, consisting of a huge amount of required moves, and as they are all found on the main path, there's absolutely no way to avoid them. Now thankfully, as we live in the age of high-speed internet, there is a way out if you find yourself really struggling, but you're going to have to keep that walkthrough close to hand, as in a moment of developmental madness, these puzzles reset after you've completed them. For some baffling reason, Matsuno and his team decided to turn these moments into a sort of mini-game, and every single time you return to a room containing a box puzzle, the screen will flash with the phrase "Evolve or Die," which sounds exciting, but in reality is just a timed version of a puzzle you've already solved. There's absolutely no reward for finishing them within the estimate time, and all this adds to the game is the constant repetition of one of its worst ideas. Almost as if this was recognised, in the main menu it's possible to turn off puzzle mode, which keeps each one solved after the first time. But just like with the weapon affinity changes, it's hidden away, and many players will likely have no idea that this was ever an option. The whole system isn't so much low quality as it is brutally frustrating. The puzzles are legitimately quite clever, but their frequency, complexity and aesthetic just don't mesh with the rest of the game, and they stick out like a sore thumb. Almost every other system has some sort of root in the narrative. Ashley's magic and abilities are reawakened from his lost memories, the monsters and bosses are products of the dark power of Lea Monde, and the risk system simulates fatigue. To have such a major part of the gameplay just be there, with no explanation whatsoever, feels very disappointing, and it's especially glaring considering other premier PlayStation titles like Silent Hill, Resident Evil and Soul Reaver do such a good job of blending a variety of different puzzles into their setting. Lea Monde feels like the perfect opportunity to get really creative with the non-combat gameplay, but instead we're stuck with a timed box-pushing minigame. Not exactly the finest moment of Matsuno's glittering career. So with either the Bandit's Hollow or the Western Undercity behind us, Ashley once again emerges into the Lea Monde town centre, where the game unfurls its structural wings. Instead of constantly ploughing forwards, we're now hunting for keys and sigils, studying the map and travelling back to previous locations in order to investigate those shadowy pathways. Now we'll discuss the narrative implications of this in just a second, as all of this backtracking leads us to one final gameplay system, and boy is it a doozy. Inside of Snowfly Forest, there is an optional boss called the Earth Dragon. It's nothing too special, but when it goes down, you receive the Bronze Key, which is a rather important item. Many hours later, when you emerge from the Bandit's Hollow, you can head up to the northern portion of Lea Monde's town centre, where you will discover a door which is unlocked with that key. This leads to a very small sequence of rooms that culminate in a fight against the Lich, a particularly challenging boss that teleports around the room and can hit you with a spell that does over 200 HP of damage, which is virtually your entire health bar. It's a tough fight, but through using a spell called Magic Ward, which cancels incoming magic, and feverishly reapplying it every time it breaks, you're able to fire off a few hits against the monster's head, and once it's silenced, victory becomes an inevitability. Now while all this is technically optional, the reward for defeating the Lich is so intrinsic to the design of the game that it's something every player will want to snag, and that is the ability to teleport between save points. With the game world opening up and the focus drifting from forward progression to much looser exploration, this is a huge deal, and it saves a lot of time that would otherwise be spent repeating minor encounters. Outside of the weapon alignment changes, there's no leveling system in Vagrant Story, which means that killing enemies doesn't offer any reward beyond the gear they drop. And this means that when you're travelling from A to B, there's actually no need to fight enemies that you've already defeated. So this begs the question, outside of finding the next zone, what's the point of being able to return to previous locations, and why would we ever need to do that? Well, the answer is to visit the workshops and engage in Vagrant Story's most controversial feature, its crafting system. Early in the game, the equipment and weapon system is relatively straightforward, and anyone who's played an RPG will find it very easy to wrap their head around. You have an armour slot for each body part, and while you start with poor quality gear, through opening treasure chests and defeating monsters, you can find better items that boost Ashley's core stats. These are Strength, which represents physical defense and attack, Intelligence, which represents magical defense and attack, and Agility, which is your chance to successfully hit enemies and evade hits. While upgrading a single piece of armour probably won't make that much of a difference, the cumulative effect across every single slot can be quite large, and as all three stats are equally important, it makes developing your armour just as crucial as developing your weapons. So during the first few hours, you're in a constant state of swapping out gear, with its power level represented by its material. At first you'll be using wood and leather items, and then as you progress further into the game, you'll begin to find bronze gear, and then iron gear, and eventually Hagane gear. It's as traditional of a system as you're likely to find. But then, why would that require returning to previous zones? Well, the issue is that you can end up finding pretty good armour relatively early on, and in my playthrough, by the time I reached Snowfly Forest, which is just under halfway through the game, I had a full suit of Hagane armour. Now this probably sounds like I'd either gotten very lucky or gone out of my way to game the system, but the reality is quite the opposite. Vagrant Story is designed for you to reach this stage fairly quickly, and that's because in the second half of the game, your equipment's progression isn't governed by what you find, but by what you create. This is the purpose of the workshops, of which there are 5 located throughout Lea Monde, and which allow Ashley to manufacture and combine different weapons and armour, pushing their power level well above the standard numbers. It's here that things start to get confusing, and for many people, this system represents exactly the sort of pointless complexity that Matsuno's previous games had been criticised for. So let me try and walk you through how this crazed mess is supposed to work. Essentially, different workshops relate to different materials. So at Work of Art, you can forge wood, leather, and bronze, and at Keen's Crafts, you can forge iron and Hagane, with each of the 5 relating to different combinations of materials. This distinction is important because if you combine 2 items of the same type and of 2 lower tiers, they'll transform into a higher tier version. So a bronze shield combined with an iron shield will create a Hagane shield. Now in addition to this, each armour piece comes in 16 different forms, which themselves can be found in many different material types. This means that your bronze shield is actually a bronze buckler, and your iron shield is actually an iron pelter. And by combining different versions of the same item, you can create stronger items that can't be found out in the world. Once all your gear is at Hagane level, this is the process you follow to improve its stats. You defeat different enemies, which allows you to find different drops, and then head back to the workshops in order to see what you can make. Now explained in a video like this, that probably doesn't sound too bad, but the system is rife with issues and feels as if it was designed to purposefully confuse players. Firstly, there is no in-game way to know what items will take you to the next level of power, which means every time you find something new, you have to head back to the workshop in order to check if it will combine with your current gear, and as Ashley has limited inventory spaces, you'll be doing this a lot. It means turning around, travelling to a save point, teleporting to a workshop, loading into the setup screen, which is for some reason located in the main menu rather than by activating a workbench, and then going into the combine screen. This process is made all the more painful because you can't see how powerful the item you're making will be, which means it's perfectly possible to accidentally downgrade your gear. You need to save before every single item change, which is another extremely time-consuming process. As if that wasn't bad enough, if you find an item that you want to save for later or simply don't want to destroy, you have to do a full save every single time you access the workshop's storage box. Between safety saves and storage system saves, you spend more time staring at this screen than actually experimenting with your gear, and accidentally storing the wrong item and having to repeat the process all over again is unbearably painful. Now, if that sounds like quite a lot of hard work, we've not even got onto weapon crafting, which has yet another layer which you have to consider. Instead of weapons combining into each other like armour and shields, they're made up of two parts: blades and grips, which have to be disassembled before we can do any combining. Blades follow the same system as your armour, with each weapon type having a hierarchy. The spatha and scimitar combine to make the short sword, which combines with the scimitar to make the firangi, which combines with the short sword to make the samshir, and so on and so forth. On their own, these blades don't actually do anything, so you then have to pair them with a grip, which have their own strength levels, and define if the finished weapon will be edged, piercing, or blunt. This means that while you're out in the wild, you're not only looking for new weapons to combine, but have to keep your eyes out for new blades and new grips, which of course means hundreds and thousands of trips to the workshops to check if anything leads to an upgrade. The whole system is frankly absurd, and it makes the use of a walkthrough virtually mandatory, as you can easily spend double or triple the amount of time in the workshops that you do playing the rest of the game. Unfortunately, the sheer complexity of this system and how intrinsic it is to your late game power raises another set of issues, and these relate to Vagrant Story's difficulty curve. We spoke earlier about how much of this game's level of challenge directly correlates to your understanding of its concepts, and this complex web of workshops, blades, combining, and endless saving dramatically sharpens that dynamic. If you're following a crafting workthrough and making sure that your equipment and weapons are always increasing in power, the final few zones like the Limestone Quarry and Temple of Kalita can be laughably easy, with Ashley taking out major bosses in just a few chain attacks. In fact, we've not even spoken about gems, which are a special item that can be socketed into certain weapons and shields, which add elemental or type bonuses. In the early and mid game, they're just useful tools to have in certain situations, but as you near the credits, you'll have collected a huge amount of them. As higher tier weapons have 2 or even 3 gem slots, you can very easily create weapons that do ludicrous amounts of damage to certain enemy types. And really, if you're casting your buffs and debuffs, attaching the right gems, progressing your gear and hitting your chains, Ashley is virtually unkillable. Now, while it's certainly novel to wipe out a terrifying golem or ogre lord in a few seconds, it quickly turns the gameplay into a repetitive slog, and as the strategy drains away, so does the enjoyment. You never need to worry about risk, never have to manage your magic, never have to worry about which body part you're targeting, and never deviate from this one single way of approaching every single encounter. It's particularly disappointing as there's no way to avoid this happening, as just like with Father Duane all the way back at the start of our playthrough, failure to properly engage with the crafting system means you simply won't have the power to cope with late game enemies. Without upgraded gear, you'll be locked to low levels of strength, which means enemies hit really hard and take virtually no damage, and without additional gem slots, you'll be stuck grinding for affinity every single time you face a new boss. In this version of the game, the Limestone Quarry and Temple of Kalita are brutal hellscapes, and it's very hard to find a middle ground where you can still make meaningful progression without totally destroying Vagrant Story's balance. This is the true problem at the heart of Vagrant Story's crafting. Yes, it's overly complex, yes, it's ridiculously time consuming, but its greatest crime is that it's simply too powerful, and in a game designed to be an orchestra of interwoven mechanics, even the slightest misstep can throw the whole thing off. Thankfully, we are given more than ample reason to play on, as while Vagrant Story's gameplay stumbles in its final few hours, its narrative goes from strength to strength, and ends up concluding with a clarity that very few video games have ever managed to achieve. In his Ultimania interview, Yasumi Matsuno outlined how, through the core of what he was trying to achieve in Vagrant Story, ran 2 distinct ideas: fragmentation and ambiguity. Now, these concepts were virtually alien to the straightforward and exposition-heavy RPG genre, but Matsuno wanted to inject a heavy dose of debate. and inspired by movies like Seven and The Usual Suspects, he set out to write a story that would leave people arguing around the metaphorical water cooler. While the story has a clear beginning, middle and end, much of the detail is left up to the player's own interpretation, and the idea was that no two accounts of Vagrant Story would ever be exactly the same. Much like everything else in his career, it was an extremely ambitious idea, but the beauty of Vagrant Story, and the main reason for its legendary reputation, is that while its gameplay systems may have clear drawbacks, its storyline is one of the best ever told in the medium. It is fragmented, ambiguous, and utterly genius. As we've seen already in the game's opening sequences, Matsuno's masterful use of mystery is one of its strongest characteristics, and once we are in Lea Monde proper, everything quickly begins to orbit around three enigmas: the question of Ashley's past, the reasons for Sydney's actions, and the nature of the city itself. And as we'll discover, all three are beautifully composed, drip-feeding you information and pricking at your curiosity before exploding in a triad of grand reveals. We'll start with the third, the nature of Lea Monde, as given we've just spent a large amount of time discussing its structure from a gameplay perspective, I think it's time we shed some light on its role within the world of Valendia. At various points during our adventure, Ashley's mind is pulled from his body, and through some strange form of magic he's able to see faraway events and eavesdrop on conversations that are happening on the other side of the city. The first time this phenomena occurs is deep inside of the abandoned mines, and after falling to his knees, Ashley finds himself staring out from behind the eyes of Agent Callow Mallows, which is signified by a jarring switch into first person and white borders that simulate human vision. Thankfully, Mallows is unharmed, but all is not well within Mullenkamp. Sydney and Hardin are locked in argument, with the second in command desperate for the cult to withdraw as their followers are falling in droves and the day seems lost. Sydney is far less concerned, and at the peak of Hardin's panic, the Prophet appears to magically compel him into obedience, ordering him to take Mallows and Joshua deeper into Lea Monde, while he doubles back and deals with Guildenstern. The final thing we see through Callow's eyes is that same ghostly child, who whispers a single line: he intends to die, before we snap back to Ashley and continue with our pursuit. Now obviously this is a very clever way to further the plot, as both player and protagonist are learning about the world and its characters in tandem, but Matsuno takes this idea a lot further, twisting a narrative tool into an important piece of world building. As we push on, we discover that these bouts of farsight are not just happening to Ashley, as unnatural powers begin to spring out of everyone who has entered the city. We see holy priests of the church find the strength to summon demons, normal foot soldiers suddenly discovering that they can wield powerful magics, and most perplexing of all are the newfound abilities of Agent Mallows. In a much later scene, Callow and Hardin are holed up in a warehouse, hiding from Guildenstern's forces, and as she plies the cultists for information, she makes a startling discovery. Despite Hardin refusing to answer her questions, she's able to see a ghostly image of him, and this phantom reveals the truth that lies inside of his heart. Mullenkamp had betrayed the Duke because he sought to seal the wellspring of their power, a decision driven by a terminal illness and a fear that his dabbling in the dark arts would condemn his soul to hell. Clearly this was not acceptable to the cult, and they'd attacked the manor looking for the key, an item which allows its bearer to command the power of the wellspring, something called the Grand Grimoire. Now the Grand Grimoire is first mentioned by Guildenstern, who believes it to be a legendary version of the magical books that Ashley has been learning spells from, a tome so powerful that it bestows control over the machinery of life itself. This is the prize Vagrant Story's factions are vying to claim, but Callow's interrogation of Hardin's heart reveals an important missing piece. It's not just the key that is required to control the grimoire, but the status of bearer, a role that can only be taken through a rite of succession. Who is the current bearer? Well, none other than Sydney Losserot. Clearly this hunt for the city's power is having a strange effect on those who are embroiled within it, and so to find our answers we'll need to discuss a character that embodies the ambiguity that Matsuno was so entranced by. Many of Vagrant Story's most interesting scenes revolve around Jan Rosenkrantz, the Duke's knight who we saw being sent into Lea Monde right at the very start of the game. He's relatively absent from the first half, but he plays an important role in understanding both Lea Monde and Ashley's past, although as we'll discover, the extent of his explanations are a matter of some debate. Now as the player, we're conditioned to be deeply suspicious of Rosencrantz, not only because of his shadowy introduction, but because throughout our journey we regularly see short clips of him trailing Ashley, hiding in the background and observing from a safe distance. Well, when he finally steps into the spotlight as Ashley arrives at Snowfly Forest, those misgivings are further confirmed, as he introduces himself as a risk breaker who's been sent to provide backup and partner Ashley on his mission. Now obviously we know this isn't the case, and Ashley quickly reveals his own doubts, as VKP missions are never changed in the field, and so he refuses to cooperate. In response, the mysterious knight chastises Ashley for being so sure of his own thoughts, when in reality he knows nothing of the situation, declaring that the VKP have sent him into Lea Monde blind, an idea that piques Ashley's curiosity. He asks for Rosencrantz's version of the truth, and here the curtain begins to rise on the nature of the dead city. Rosencrantz claims that it is the city itself that is prompting magical awakenings, and this is because the Wellspring and Lea Monde are one and the same thing. The city had long been connected to an ancient power called the Dark, the very same energy that the cult of Mullenkamp worship, but when the earthquake struck 25 years ago, the sheer weight of freshly departed souls caused the Dark to erupt in power, a larder stocked well with corpses. Despite Rosencrantz's insistence, Ashley remained skeptical, refusing to believe that the VKP would hide something so important, and with a threat of reprisal if they ever meet again, he leaves Jan behind and heads into the forest to resume his mission. Now, I love this as a piece of world building because not only is it deeply original, but it's delivered in a way that feels very natural for a fantasy game. Lea Monde is essentially a magical Chernobyl, an area scarred by disaster that's steeped in misinformation and debate, housing horrible secrets and presenting real danger to the people that go there. As a justification for magic and monsters, it's much more interesting than simply having them be a natural part of the world, and it means that instead of clunky exposition, we get to discover these otherworldly concepts through surprise, shock and revelation. The only issue is that this account comes from Jan Rosencrantz, who we know to be a liar, and this casts quite a heavy shadow of doubt over the story that we've just been told. While we can see that there are monsters and magic and strange powers growing in our protagonist, can we really trust the words of a man whose very first line was a brazen attempt to court our favour? These questions and doubts only become more prominent when we reach the Lea Monde Keep and the next encounter with the Duke's Knight. Here we find Guildenstern and Samantha pondering the nature of the city, fascinated by the etchings and designs that adorn the surface of every road and building. From the shadows emerges Rosencrantz, once again revelling in the ignorance of others, mocking the Blades for not having worked out the true purpose of the city. He claims that Lea Monde is not only the wellspring of the dark, but the Grand Grimoire itself. Not a mere labyrinth to house some ancient text, but a vast magical circle, designed thousands of years ago to channel energy through its architecture and into the bearer and the key. Guildenstern is disgusted at this revelation, accusing Rosencrantz of withholding information and allowing good knights to die in a pointless hunt. He calls him a harlot, a worm, and then surprisingly says that it is no wonder that someone with such little honour was expelled from the VKP. It turns out that the story in Snowfly Forest might not have been all that fanciful, and as Guildenstern would have no reason to lie, we can only assume that Rosencrantz actually is, or at least was, a risk breaker. It casts even more confusion over the things he's told us, and this gets worse as the scene continues. While both the knights draw their arms, Samantha collapses as she can sense Ashley using his farsight powers to observe through her eyes, and this offers enough of a distraction for Rosencrantz to slink away, with the two Crimson Blades following hot on his heels. Only, this is misdirection. As we approach the door to head after them, the two knights stride out side by side, animosity seemingly forgotten, and Rosencrantz happy to take orders from Guildenstern, who commands him to kill the disruptive risk-breaker. Ashley has walked into a trap, and yet again we have to ask ourselves, is anything we overheard actually true? Were the knights really at each other's throats, or simply putting on a performance? Or is this just a ploy to throw the VKP off of their trail? What makes this so engaging is that Matsuno never provides clear answers, and it's entirely left up to you to try and deduce Rosencrantz's intentions, and how the history of Lea Monde ties into the strange events that we witness. Obviously, this really sets the game apart from the straightforward and expository heavy writing that usually characterises Japanese role-playing games, but it's also a pretty clever move considering the structure of Vagrant Story's world. As we spend all of our time in a single location, there's far less potential for expansive world building, and without any towns to visit or NPCs to interact with, Lea Monde could easily feel devoid of life, acting only as a shell for combat and having little impact on the game's narrative. Instead, what we get is almost akin to another character on the stage, with the setting itself playing a major role in the story and delivering just as many twists and revelations as you'd expect from the cast. Now, as interesting as all this is, the purpose of Lea Monde is easily the lesser of Vagrant Story's three mysteries, and the true heart of Matsuno's fragmented genius lies in the backstories of Ashley Riot and Sydney Losserot. So let's recap quickly. When we last peered into Ashley's mind, we were right at the start of the game, in the wine cellar, and Sydney was implying that Ashley's failure to protect Tia and Marco was tantamount to him murdering them himself. It's a typical tragic backstory. A noble warrior loses his family and falls into a nihilistic life of violence, extracting revenge from the underbelly of society and not caring if he lives or dies. At the start of the game, in the midst of a hostage situation and a race to capture a dangerous terrorist, we can accept all this with little issue, but as we've just discussed, things in Vagrant Story are not always as they seem, and as more doubt is cast over Ashley's mission, so too does a shadow creep into his past. Once again, this begins in Snowfly Forest, which I've got to say I really like because it means you get a nice long chunk of game before things start to unravel, and it makes the revelations and twists hit all the harder. After Ashley rejects Rosencrantz's aid, he heads into the forest, and when he eventually emerges on the other side, he's thrust into a situation that turns the narrative on its head. In a clearing, he stumbles upon Sydney in combat with a Crimson Blade priest called Grissom, the brother of Duane, who had split from his regiment in order to seek revenge for his death. Grissom is easily defeated by the leader of Mullenkamp, but in his desperation, he reaches out to the dark and summons a powerful Phantom Knight, requiring Ashley and Sydney to work together in order to defeat this abomination. Once Grissom's killed, the two rivals are left in an uneasy peace, and instead of the violence that marked their last meeting, they instead begin to talk. Sydney asks what Ashley believes of Lea Monde and the Dark, to which Ashley once more claims that he won't believe anything without evidence, choosing to trust in himself rather than the words of others. This seems to amuse the prophet, and as if to prove the folly of his words, they once again dive into Ashley's own memories. The scene plays out in exactly the same way, a loving family sharing food, drink and laughter, but when tragedy strikes, this time things are different. As Tia falls to the floor, it is not a bandit holding the blade, but Ashley. And while he protests this as a foul lie, Sydney asserts that it is his own memories that are deceiving him. He claims Ashley's past is nothing more than a fabrication. He was no Kingsguard, there was no tragic murder, and Tia and Marco are not even real. In truth, he was a highly skilled assassin, and after killing an innocent family in a hit gone wrong, he was consumed by a guilt that the VKP preyed upon. They twisted his desire to escape from his actions into the lost family backstory, tampering with his memories in order to create a super soldier willing to undertake missions that nobody else would. Again, Ashley cries out that this must be trickery, but Sydney asks him to search within himself for the truth. Why are repressed memories of battle techniques bubbling to the surface, if not from a long-forgotten life as a butcher for hire? Ashley lashes out, but it's to no avail, and Sydney continues to press the point. If memory is nothing more than a picture conjured in the mind, any number of things can turn truth into illusion. And if demons and monsters can walk the streets of a dead city, why couldn't his mind have been altered? The scene ends with the defeated Riskbreaker kneeling on the ground, asking what Sydney wants of him, to which the prophet replies nothing more than the truth, and beckons Ashley to follow him deeper into Lea Monde. At this point, everything we understand about the game and its characters flips on its head. Obviously, the biggest question lies over the VKP and their influence on Ashley's confused past. So far, we've simply assumed them to be a benevolent force, trying to keep the realm safe from the politicking of nobles and the whims of dangerous cults, but is brainwashing and reprogramming criminals really something a righteous organisation would do? Similarly, what does this mean for Ashley? Is our hero even really that heroic? Is he on a tragic quest to find redemption, or just a robotic killing machine, executing orders without any thought or question, ignorant of the motivations of his masters or those that fall under his blade? Really, we still know almost nothing about the goals of the various factions, and Sydney's actions here distort the picture even further. He aids Ashley in battle, spares his life when he's vulnerable, and claims to only be interested in the truth. Again, not exactly the conduct of a dangerous and malevolent terrorist. So from here, our mission changes in its purpose. We're now chasing down Sydney, not in order to arrest him, but to catch a glimpse of the truth he offers. And our status as the virtuous hero battling the forces of evil might not be as clear-cut as it first seemed. Now, incredibly, this is not the only time a character attempts to lift the curtain on Ashley's past, as there is another scene, about an hour or so later, that offers a completely contradictory viewpoint. Outside of the Lea Monde keep, after stepping into Guildenstern and Rosencrantz's trap, you're forced to do battle with the ex-Riskbreaker, and once he's defeated, the loquacious knight complains that the VKP did a poor job of repressing Ashley's battle abilities. Surprised at this, Agent Ryan asks what he knows of his damaged memory, and here we are delivered another version of that fateful summer day. Rosencrantz claims that Ashley and him are old comrades, working together for the VKP, but not as heroic knights of justice, law and order. They were political hatchet men, murdering revolutionaries, activists and reformers, enforcing the will of the state with brutal efficiency. He recalls that the family lying dead under that old oak were accidental witnesses to their barbarism, and as per VKP doctrine, Ashley and Rosencrantz had no choice but to eliminate them. Like so many Riskbreakers before him, drained with the endless butchery, this was the final straw for Ashley, and he attempted to desert, only for Rosencrantz to report him and for the VKP to wipe his mind, unwilling to lose one of their finest agents. Now, Rosencrantz says this was an act of self-preservation, and the real fault lies with the political class of Valendia that forced good men into such deplorable actions, a status quo that he intends to break with the power of Lea Monde. To this, Ashley simply replies that Rosencrantz is a poor loser, and while he allows the knight to flee, he's left once again pondering the lies people tell themselves, and to what degree they might actually believe them. It would be very easy to simply dismiss this account as more of Rosencrantz's lies. After all, he's clearly a man that will say anything to get out of a desperate situation. But there are a few problems with that interpretation that mean we can't ignore it wholesale. For example, how does he know about the family and the picnic under the tree? How does he know about Ashley's repressed battle techniques? There's no way he could be privy to this information unless the two men had met before that encounter in Snowfly Forest. That being said, we know him to be a liar, and given Sydney's mercy and Rosencrantz's aggression, it's easy to find yourself believing the former. But the thing is, we also know that Sydney isn't entirely trustworthy. Cast your mind back to the very first scene in Lea Monde, where Merlose was debriefing Ashley about his target. One of the powers she describes Sydney possessing is the ability to compel others to obey his will, and we even see this in action during his and Hardin's argument. While we have every reason to disbelieve Rosencrantz, we have just as much to doubt Sydney, as there is no guarantees that his truth is not just a fabrication that Ashley is being compelled to believe. Both men have every reason to want the VKP out of the picture, and both men fear the power that Ashley is regaining. So this leaves us in a predicament. Either one could be lying, or both stories could be false. Maybe the truth is some twisted combination of all three, or maybe Tia and Marco are real, and the true tragedy is the villainous manipulation that makes our protagonist doubt them. The beauty is that these questions are never answered, and while the story of Ashley Riot and Sydney Losserot in the dead city of Lea Monde does come to a definitive conclusion, the mystery of that summer day is left entirely up to you. Now, for some this might be disappointing, and the lack of answers an unsatisfying way to leave such an interesting riddle, but I think this is exactly the sort of artistic risk that video games need to be more comfortable taking. Instead of presenting all this possibility and then dishing out a clear answer, it elevates the experience beyond the hours you spend with the game. You think about it long after you've finished, debate theories with people years later, discover new clues on subsequent playthroughs, and maybe even write a lengthy script debating the merits of each argument. This is something that is so common in the world of cinema, but so rarely used in video game writing. almost as if developers are scared to leave things up to the player's interpretation, and that's such a shame, as Matsuno proved that this fragmented approach can create incredibly memorable drama. In many ways, I think this is Vagrant Story's legacy, not only pushing back against the tired tropes of its genre, but innovating with how video game stories could be told, asking you to genuinely think and respecting your conclusions. It is just brilliant writing, and we still have an entire mystery left to discuss, one which will take us right to the centre of Lea Monde and the game's final moments. So before we reach Vagrant Story's thrilling conclusion, we have a little detour to make, as there's an undiscussed spectre looming over this game. Another way in which Vagrant Story broke the mould and pushed the medium of video games to new heights. Back in the 1980s and early 1990s, the translation of Japanese developed games into English was never seen as much of a priority. Thanks to the strength of their home market, most Eastern publishers placed very little importance on appealing to American and European audiences. This was particularly common within the RPG genre, where lengthy scripts made the translation process rather complex, and surprisingly often, games that were dominating the charts in Japan never made their way across the Pacific. Squaresoft had a particularly mixed record in this area. They'd localised Final Fantasy I, but not 2. And then on the Super Nintendo they'd become even more erratic. Final Fantasy IV and VI were translated, but not 5, and while spin-offs like Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana saw English language releases, others like Romancing Saga, Live Alive and Front Mission all went missing. Now this was largely due to how Square handled translation, which if you can believe was done largely on a volunteer basis, all taking place outside of normal working hours and often by employees who knew absolutely nothing about the games they were working on. Obviously, as the company grew and foreign demand began to build, this had to change, and eventually an English localization team was set up in Square's Washington office. This consisted of a single man, Ted Woolsey, whose reputation is legendary and notorious in equal measure. Thanks to the difficulty in transforming Japanese into English, Woolsey often made wholesale changes to the scripts he received, and depending on who you ask, these inaccuracies are either charming or dreadful. While some changes could be inspired, like renaming the heroine of Final Fantasy VI from Tina to Terra, or swapping out the boring phantom beasts for the much more mythological espers, he would often lean into a quite goofy sense of humour, and regularly came up with lines that would clash with the serious tone of the original scripts. Regardless of how you feel about Woolsey's style, the fact remains that the Japanese versions were still seen as the definitive editions, and very little changed as Squaresoft continued to grow and evolve. By the time they were developing for the PlayStation, their localization team had grown to a handful of employees, but the work was often still quite wonky, and it was perfectly common for dialogue and prompts to be mistranslated, which often led to player confusion. At its worst, it would actively hold back the English versions, like in Final Fantasy VIII, where huge portions of Squall's dialogue are replaced with him saying "whatever," which, while being a functional translation, misses the nuance of his Japanese replies and paints him as a much more dour character. Now, it might be easy to blame this problem on a lack of care, but in the team's defence, Japanese to English translations are really pretty difficult, as the two languages are very different, and everything from the way sentences are formed to the tone and presentation of words all have to be taken into consideration. As Japanese text is typically much longer than English, even elements like the amount of storage on a disk could influence how text was translated. And the reality was that it was a pretty thankless task that few people felt passionate about. This all changed when Alexander O. Smith joined Yasumi Matsuno's team, and through his work on Vagrant Story, they set a new standard for how Japanese language games could feel in English. After finishing his degree in Japanese language, O. Smith had moved to Tokyo, where he began his career translating soap operas, although just like Matsuno, he found himself drawn into the growing world of video games. After a short stint at Sega, he jumped across the city to Squaresoft, where he had an immediate impact, working on titles like Front Mission 3, Chocobo's Dungeon, and Parasite Eve 2, all of which had much better standards of translation. This reputation for high quality work meant that he was able to pick and choose his projects, and when Alexander heard that Yasumi Matsuno was working on a high fantasy thriller inspired by literature and classic films, he had to be involved. In an interview with US Gamer years later, O. Smith would recount that this was exactly the sort of project he had joined Square to work on, not only because he loved Matsuno's work, but because his master's was in Japanese literature, and he'd been desperate to sink his teeth into something more substantial. This would eventually lead to the two men meeting at Square's Tokyo office, and in typical Matsuno style, all he asked of O. Smith was for him to make his work sound biblical. A suitably ambitious brief for a game that was aiming to break all the established RPG conventions. Now for O. Smith, this was music to his ears, as it lined up perfectly with his own translation philosophy. He's spoken about it many times in interviews, but in short, he sees localization as a twofold job. Firstly, there's the work of literally replicating the words in another language, and then a far more creative process, that of reworking the content into something that is not only functional, but maintains the soul and intention of the original script. For Vagrant Story, this meant quite significant changes, as O. Smith wanted to take the themes and setting and infuse them into every text bubble, complementing Matsuno's enthralling story with lots of Old English imagery and metaphor. For example, when Ashley first enters into Lea Monde, he eavesdrops on two Crimson Blade foot soldiers discussing the dead city. In the original Japanese, it translates to something along the lines of, "Is this magic stuff really that easy to use? If you believe the studies of ancient legend, there were these grimoires that allow anyone to use it." In O. Smith's own words, it's perfectly serviceable. Good even, as it's full of lots of flavour regarding Lea Monde's history. But he wanted to push things even further and transport the player to an imagined past. The lines were reworked into the far more poetic, "Swine'll take wing 'fore the likes of us use magic, my friend. Aye, but with a grimoire, your fattest sow could outfly my swiftest falcon, if ye believe the chroniclers." It's the very same structure, the same function, and almost the same length, but it's so much more alive, dripping with medieval flavour and enhancing these very minor characters into a memorable moment. Similarly, O. Smith wanted to make sure that whenever they did use imagery to embellish the language, it only ever served to complement Matsuno's narrative, with an excellent example being the hunting metaphor that Sydney uses to provoke Ashley. Originally, the line had Sydney refer to himself as a rabbit and Ashley as the hunter, but in English this was changed to the hunter and the hart, a medieval term for deer, which also doubles as an allusion to his role at the centre of Lea Monde's mystery. In fact, Sydney is the main beneficiary of O. Smith's influence, and in the English language version, he's transformed from a mysterious villain into an enigmatic scholar, with his words often as puzzling as his actions. Take his confrontation with Guildenstern and Samantha in the Lea Monde town square. Here he delivers a diatribe criticising their church and faith, and considering just how often organised religion is the enemy in JRPGs, this could so easily feel generic and played out. Instead, it's phrased with another wonderful metaphor, and O. Smith turns his heretical beliefs into Shakespearean poetry. "Oh please, warping the minds of men and shepherding the masses has always been your church's domain. You lure sheep with empty miracles and a dead god. Or perhaps you too are sheep, Samantha, a poor little lamb, bleating for your faith as though it were milk of the poppy. Yet mark your saviour well, for he is one of the demons you so fear, Samantha." It's just dripping with venom and drama, further emphasising how the Blades have fallen into Mullenkamp's trap without having to adjust the core of Sydney's message, which is that he is a religious heretic. The reality is that this combination of Matsuno's storytelling and O. Smith's flair for creative translation created something beautiful, and for the first time, Squaresoft produced a game that legitimately felt better in English than it did in Japanese. In almost every review, O. Smith was paid massive credit for his work, and Vagrant Story quickly became the new standard which Japanese games were held to, and quite rightly, as it was miles ahead of anything else available at the time. Of course, there would still be poor translations in the future, but Alexander O. Smith deserves a huge amount of credit for showing the Japanese market just how creative the art of translation could be, and beckoning in a new age where English role-playing fans didn't always have to settle for confusing and misleading prose. Obviously, the acclaim Vagrant Story brought O. Smith catapulted him to international fame, and over the next decade he worked on a spate of high-profile franchises like Fire Emblem, Ace Attorney, Mega Man, and was even drafted into the production team for Final Fantasy X, where he again made key contributions to its fantastic script. He now runs his own independent translation company, Kaijia Productions, where he's still heavily involved in video game localization, but also covers manga, novels, and movies, long ago having earned the right to work as he chooses. His contribution to Vagrant Story and the wider industry might not be the headline grabber that you clicked on this video to discover, but it is as important a contribution as anyone else on the team, and I hope this section can do justice to a practice that is all too often denied the credit it deserves. So let's get back to the game, as we have one final mystery to resolve. The question of Sidney Losserot's goals and who or what he truly is. Now, while the second half of the game is considerably more open-ended, asking you to hunt down keys and sigils and giving you the power to quickly backtrack across the map, eventually the focus closes in and funnels you towards two final locations. These are the Temple of Kirita and the Grand Cathedral, two monuments to the warring religions that are spilling blood in the streets of the city. Reflecting this opposition, the two buildings are at Lea Monde's highest and lowest points, with the temple found deep beneath the Undercity and the cathedral looming over the town centre, and it is within their walls that Vagrant Story's narrative comes to an end. The first piece of closure occurs when we arrive at the temple, and after defeating a water elemental, Ashley's farsight takes him across the city, where he sees Guildenstern, Rosencrantz, Samantha, and the remaining Blades arriving at the Grand Cathedral. Inside, they have finally cornered Hardin, Mallows, and Joshua, but as they move in to capture their prey, Rosencrantz slips away from the main group. Now, before we come face to face with the trickster, Ashley's vision shifts, and we're now peering inside of the cathedral, as the remnants of Mullenkamp hide in the building's spire. We see that Mallows' powers have continued to grow, and she's now able to investigate the hearts of those around her without revealing her intentions. As Hardin cares for the young boy Joshua, she looks into his past and makes another shocking discovery. Hardin had been a member of the Valendian Peace Guard and had been thrown in prison after his unit was discovered to be abusing their power in order to smuggle weapons. The VKP had offered Hardin his freedom in exchange for the names of his fellow smugglers, and because he had a sickly brother, he chose to betray his friends. Unfortunately, the VKP did not honour their agreement, and after throwing him in jail, they executed his unit and left his younger brother to die in the streets. Mallows finds that Hardin's membership of Mullenkamp isn't thanks to religious zeal, but because he sees Sidney's power as his only method of destroying the system that he holds responsible. And it's clear that his care and attention to Joshua comes from guilt of being unable to save his family. Now, this might lead you to view Hardin as a sympathetic character. He's kind to a child and simply wants revenge for the disproportionate punishment he received, but just like everything else in Vagrant Story, it's not that simple. Remember, this is the man who ordered the execution of the hostages in Duke Bardorba's manor, and for as cruel as the VKP may have been to him, he had committed the crimes that he stood accused of. It's another dose of Matsuno ambiguity, but before we have time to ponder this further, the Crimson Blades arrive and Guildenstern takes control of the cathedral. Now, other than a few scenes in the Lea Monde town centre, we've not actually seen all that much of Romeo Guildenstern, but from here he assumes a primary role in the plot, and it's clear that he's far more than just a tool of the church. Using the power awakened in him by the city, he's able to conjure an illusion of Sidney, which he uses to trick Hardin into revealing the cult's plan. The key everyone has been searching for is something called the Blood Sin. And while Hardin doesn't actually know what this is, he does know that the bearer must assume the key and then sacrifice their phantom soul in order to claim the throne of Lea Monde. To anyone else this would be gibberish, but in a freak coincidence, to Guildenstern this is full of meaning. He stares at the ceiling adorned with the Mark of Kildare and recalls his time in the Inquisition, where they would brand heretics with an inverted version of this symbol called the Rude Inverse, or to the heretics, the Blood Sin. With this, he realises the truth. The blood sin has been on Sydney's back this entire time. The bearer has had the key since before that fateful night at Duke Bardorba's manor. Now, not only is this revelation masterfully presented with captivating camera work and outrageously expressive facial animations, but it also has really far-reaching consequences for the plot, and once again recontextualises everything we've seen so far. If Sydney is the bearer and has possessed the key all this time, why hasn't he assumed dominance over the dark? And why has he been lying to his loyal followers about their purpose in this city? As Hardin looks over to Joshua, he makes a realization. Sydney has done all of this because he is following the Duke's wishes to close the wellspring. Without Sydney even present in the room, his character transformation is complete, and the figure who began the game as a dangerous and manipulative terrorist now stands as the only person preventing the city's power from falling into the hands of those who would abuse it. With this, our attention switches to the temple, and in its altar room, we see Rosencrantz confront the bearer of the blood sin. He demands to know Sydney's intentions for Ashley, and here we discover the purpose behind everything the Prophet has done so far. Sydney has grown tired of his role as the protector of the dark and wishes to pass the responsibility over to Ashley, who he views as a perfect candidate. A blank slate, unblemished by greed or anger or desire. Rosencrantz is livid and strikes Sydney down before setting up a trap for Ashley, which is sprung the moment we enter the final room of the temple. With Ashley incapacitated, Rosencrantz once again makes his case, begging to be named successor, but in response, Sydney will only name him Worm. In his anger, Rosencrantz lashes out again, but Sydney has outsmarted him, and through the use of illusion and misdirection, he manoeuvres the Duke's Knight towards a monstrous statue, promptly comes to life and hacks Jan Rosencrantz in two. Once more, Sydney tells Ashley to follow him into the city, this time promising not just the truth, but the city itself, and with it, the power to save his wife and child. Another lie or a glimpse at the truth? We have no way to know but to enter the Grand Cathedral. This brings us to Vagrant Story's final area, the towering citadel that looms over the rest of the city, and a suitably sprawling dungeon to act as a last gameplay challenge. Now, interestingly, it's structured rather differently to the rest of the game's zones, as while it is a colossal level, comprising 33 interwoven rooms across 4 different floors, it doesn't contain any regular enemies. Instead, it's based entirely around exploration, puzzle solving, and a series of 9 boss fights, with each defeated monster opening up further areas of the cathedral. Now, this might seem like a strange decision, but it works really well, and by removing the smaller scale combat, lots of the issues which grew into the late stage gameplay end up being reduced. For starters, with only 9 enemies to fight, the constant process of analysing your enemy, switching weapons, casting buffs, casting debuffs, and then hitting chains becomes much less repetitive, and it feels like the gameplay flows at a much more enjoyable pace when you don't have to do this in every single room you visit. Similarly, because you're getting into combat far less often, and it's clearly the final zone of the game, you're free to go hell for leather and blow through all of your resources, safe in the knowledge that you won't be ambushed on the way back to a save point, which of course makes the boss fights a lot of fun. On top of this, I really like the cathedral's more open-ended structure, as once you arrive, you're free to tackle a few different bosses, and this means there isn't a set order to how you progress through its rooms. As some bosses drop sigils to open locked doors, and others activate cloudstones which allow you to platform over chasms, there's just enough variation to keep the dungeon interesting, and it's the closest that Vagrant Story comes to replicating that Resident Evil feeling of becoming intimately familiar with a smaller game space. So as we're making our way towards the 4th floor, Ashley feels Malot's using the dark to reach out to him, which allows us to witness the events happening on the roof of the cathedral, where Sydney and Guildenstern are locked in confrontation. Now, Vagrant Story is a game with many memorable scenes, but this one might be my favourite, as it's the perfect combination of the cinematic imagination of Matsuno and O. Smith's eye for poetic language. As Sydney and Guildenstern circle each other, the knight calls out that he should apologise for all of his deceptions, and Sydney, head lowered, turns to Hardin and does just that, all but confirming that he's been lying to Mullenkamp and had no intention of ever controlling the city. Unmoved by this display of penance, Guildenstern demands to know the rites of succession and what exactly one must do to sacrifice their phantom soul. To this, Sidney asks why the Crimson Blade wants to become a martyr for his fool religion, which finally causes the servant of the church to reveal his goal. Guildenstern has absolutely no intention of giving up the power of Lea Monde to the Cardinal, and instead plans to wield it himself, not for religion but revolution, to cleanse the land of its sickness, an infestation of fawning merchants and failed nobles who steal men's dreams and twist them into nightmares. His solution is a strong and unwavering justice crafted in the fires of fear. To Guildenstern, these wretches leading lives of misery do not need salvation, they require a master. To this, Sidney replies that a tyrant always dies alone, surrounded by silver-tongued leeches, and claims that he has dreamt of such a figure, choking the world with the power of the dark. Patience at an end, Guildenstern demands answers, ominously stating that if Sidney refuses, he will hew his retribution from his flesh. It's utterly gripping writing and once again goes straight to the heart of what makes Vagrant Story such an engaging story. There's simply no truly good or truly bad characters, just conflicting philosophies and personal crusades, all of which are presented with enough ambiguity that it's hard to really ever come to a concrete conclusion. While Rosencrantz is a liar and a scoundrel, his quest to destroy the political class is genuinely honourable, as we see firsthand the damage that the VKP are willing to do in order to maintain their interpretation of the law. The same applies to Hardin and the Mullenkamp cultists. They're more than happy to kill innocents and sow chaos, but their goal is the birth of a new world, one based on freedom, where normal people don't have to fear the shadowy powers of Parliament or the Church. Even Guildenstern, whose solution is the most totalitarian, isn't entirely without merit. We've seen all throughout the story just what a sorry state Valendia is in. It's a land where murder, robbery, betrayal and treason are rife, and those with power are doing nothing to alleviate it. While thousands would die under his blade, could we honestly say that life would be worse for those that survive? Is tyranny acceptable if it's benevolent in its goals? These are just not the kind of concepts that you expect to be discussing when talking about a video game that was developed in the 1990s, and it is a testament to the storytelling skill of Yasumi Matsuno that it is still as captivating today as it was on release. So with all the pieces in place, the finale springs into life. Samantha arrives at the top of the cathedral, and this provides just enough distraction for Sidney to rush over to Hardin, Mellows and Joshua and begin a teleportation spell. But before he can complete the incantation, Hardin speaks. "You sought to help the Duke. Your father." Now, instead of answering this astounding question, Sidney completes the spell and sends the three away to safety, but this gives Guildenstern the opportunity to strike. Standing over the injured bearer, he muses that he may not be able to kill the immortal, but he shall have the blood sin as his trophy regardless. Now this all takes place around halfway through the Grand Cathedral, which means we've still got quite a few bosses to defeat before Ashley catches up, and just like in the game's opening sequences, I think this is a bit of an odd choice that's been done in the name of editing. Depending on the strength of your gear, you might still be a fair few hours away from reaching the cathedral's upper level, and this can lessen the impact of all those exciting reveals. Clearly Matsuno thought it was better to space out the story, but I think it would have worked better with less downtime between the drama. Regardless, eventually Ashley does make it to the top, and here he is greeted with a horrific sight. Sidney lies bleeding in the centre of a magic circle, his back a cape of crimson flesh, as Guildenstern has hacked off the blood-sin tattoo and claimed it for his own. Cradling the man who was once his enemy, Ashley asks what happened, to which Sidney gestures to the side and beckons him to look and know. Standing in the room is the ghostly child that we've seen multiple times throughout Lea Monde, a young Sidney Losserot, the oldest child of Duke Bardorba. The consequences of this revelation run very deep, and it allows much of the plot fragments from the opening sequence to finally fall into place. The child on the picture that rests above the Duke's bed, that isn't Joshua, but Sidney, and the ghostly warning that Merlot saw, a child claiming he intends to die. Well, this was Sidney's heart foreshadowing that he wanted to give up the title of bearer. It also provides an explanation for the link between the Duke and the Mullenkamp cult, although it does make their disagreement and the attack on the manor slightly more confusing. Now, in true Matsuno style, this is left up to your own interpretation, but the best theory I've found is that the split was over who should succeed Sidney, with the Duke nominating Rosencrantz and Sidney in disagreement thanks to his obvious desire to abuse the power. The purpose of the attack on the manor was to kidnap Joshua and force the Duke to reconsider, but after unexpected interventions by the Crimson Blades and the VKP, the plan started to unravel. That is until Sidney notices that he had unwittingly uncovered the perfect successor. A blank soul, someone with no past and no desires. A truly neutral party who would sit back and allow humanity to carve out its own path, for better or worse. As Sidney weakly points to the roof, he tries to keep talking, but Ashley, who appears to have finally accepted his fate, replies with a simple "I know," and the scene fades to black. For all of Matsuno's ambiguity and fragmented storytelling, Vagrant Story ends with a crystal clear objective: prevent Romeo Guildenstern from ascending the throne of Lea Monde, which takes the form of the game's climactic boss fight. As rain lashes against the roof of the cathedral, we see a shirtless Guildenstern embracing Samantha, but this is no tender moment. On his back is the flayed skin of Sidney Losserot, bearing the blood sin, and in Samantha's stomach, a blade. Despite his love, she has been chosen as his sacrifice, and as she stares back in horror, he allows her to slip from his grasp and tumble into the darkness below. With her death, the power of the city flows into the Crimson Blade commander, and Ashley arrives just in time to see the results. Romeo turns to our protagonist with the humanity gone from his eyes, his phantom soul abandoned, with a declaration that the Riskbreaker's death will be his rebirth. Rippling with power, he summons a monstrous javelin in the shape of the inverse Rude, and as he begins to transform from man to demon, Ashley draws his own blade to answer the challenge. Now, the first phase of this fight isn't too complex, as it's much like all the other one-on-one duels that we've overcome to reach this point. You cast your buffs, make sure you have the appropriate weapon, and then it's just a matter of landing chains and keeping your health topped up. The only thing that could possibly throw things out of whack is that Guildenstern can remove your buffs, but if you follow the Lich strategy from earlier and make sure to keep up Magic Ward, there isn't a whole lot he can do, and Ashley cuts down the Tyrant without much complication. Of course, this is not the full fight, and as Guildenstern's injuries overflow with dark energy, the roof explodes with blinding light, and we are thrust into a pretty wild second phase. When Ashley opens his eyes, he's floating in the pure white of the void. And from all directions come accusations and assertions. You cannot reclaim what is lost to time. You cannot bring back the dead. Your sins are eternal. He screams, "Get thee gone, darkness," and suddenly is thrown back to that pivotal summer day. Under the tree sit his family, but as Marco rushes over to him and Tia smiles in the sunlight, all he can do is ask for their forgiveness. To this they reply with kindness, assuring him that they were a happy family despite their short time together, and as Tia tells him not to be misled by the words of others, but to believe in his own heart, they once and for all fade away to nothing. Now, while you might think this scene is meant to throw us a late curveball, implying that the original backstory was actually true all along, I'm not sure that is the intention. I think the purpose of this scene is to highlight that the truth doesn't actually matter. As Sidney told us in Snowfly Forest, if memory is but a picture in the mind, what does it matter if the picture is imagined? And if Ashley finds strength through this, the distinction between a ghost in his past and a VKP illusion is of no consequence. So, empowered either by the acceptance of his family or by his own self-forgiveness, Ashley emerges back into reality, and atop the crumbling pinnacle of the cathedral, he faces down what remains of Guildenstern. Now, this second phase is a much sterner test and can quickly spiral out of control. In his new angelic form, the Crimson Blade commander floats around the edges of the arena and is only vulnerable for a few moments when he lurches in to attack. This delay can really mess up the timing of your buffs, as they'll usually only last for a single cycle, and trying to deal damage without them is pretty pointless due to Guildenstern's high defense. This means that along with Magic Ward, you're spending a lot of magic without many opportunities to recover it through chains, which means that you either need to burn through a lot of MP items, which are fairly rare, or try a far more risky strategy. Incredibly, there is a gameplay system that we haven't discussed yet. Break Arts, which are special moves that you unlock by killing set amount of enemies with certain weapon types and cost HP to use. Now the reason we've not discussed them is that compared to chain attacks, they are pointlessly weak, but in this specific situation, where you need to unload reliable damage but can't use chains or maintain your buffs, well, here they are quite powerful. Now the downside is that this means you're not only taking damage from the boss, but also dealing damage to yourself, and you have to carefully manage your health with healing items and spells so as not to drop below a certain threshold. This is because at random points, Guildenstern will soar up into the sky and come crashing down in a massive explosion that can easily kill you if you're missing even a small chunk of health. Funnily enough, if you want to risk it even further, you can carefully time your own attack to interrupt his, but obviously this is a dangerous game to play and can easily send you back to the start of the fight. With 666 HP, Guildenstern is easily the most complex and lengthy fight in the game, and the perfect way to test your knowledge of every little combat system, once again rewarding those who know what they're doing and brutally punishing those who don't. So eventually Ashley strikes the final blow and the fallen angel starts to twist and fracture, eventually detonating in a massive explosion of dark energy. The effects of this are felt all across Lea Monde, and as the phantoms and monsters disintegrate, a second earthquake triggers, which begins to rip apart what's left of the dead city. Amidst crumbling masonry and collapsing passageways, we see Ashley attempting to carry Sydney to safety, and as he searches for a way out, the camera pans behind him to reveal the bloody marks of a freshly carved blood sin. From the sanctuary of the outskirts, Calo Malose looks on, praying for Ashley's life, but she's interrupted by Joshua, who drags her over to a dying Hardin. As he slips into Lea Monde's incomplete death, he apologises for scaring the young boy, and with a smile on his face, possibly dreaming of redemption, he fades away, leaving Malose and Joshua to look out across the city as dawn breaks. Now this would be a perfectly fitting place to end Vagrant Story, creating a parallel with the final scene of the intro sequence and providing a wonderfully ambiguous conclusion to Sydney and Ashley's relationship. But we are not finished yet, as there is the small matter of the Greylands report. Remember all the way back at the start of this video when we spoke about that hidden cutscene in the main menu, the one that claimed Ashley had killed Duke Bardorba? Well, we still need to work out why the VKP think this happened. Once the sun rises over Lea Monde, the scene shifts 1 week into the future. At Duke Bardorba's secondary residence, we see Ashley Riot enter his bedchambers, just as the report claims, but we are shown the truth of the matter. This is not the Riskbreaker, but a glamour disguising Sydney, who has come for one last reckoning with his father. The Duke appears weak, knowing that without the dark in his family, the end of his life is approaching, and so he uses this last opportunity to seek absolution. He agrees to respect Sydney's nomination of Ashley and asks for forgiveness, knowing that he has been a poor father and expected too much from his oldest child. In silence, the two embrace, and when they part, Sydney has a knife in his heart and tears in his eyes, finally free from the horrible responsibility that he has had to bear. As the screen fades to black, the Duke's men burst in and find that the noble has also passed away, the Bardorba family finally free from the curse of Lea Monde. To the VKP, all that would be reported was that Ashley Riot entered the manor, the Duke was killed, and the Riskbreaker disappeared. A reasonable assumption for the Greylands report to come to, but we know the truth. Outside of the manor, a guard approaches a hooded man and demands to see his papers, but something imperceptible changes, and as the figure spins around, it is Calo Malose, who presents her VKP credentials and wishes the guard on his way. As the footman leaves, there is another change. It is not Malose, but Ashley Riot, using the power of the dark as Sydney had before, guarding it from humanity and humanity from it. A silent protector in the shadows, bearing this weight for the rest of time. Our last screen is an uncredited quote, and so began the story of the Wanderer, the Vagrant. The tale of Ashley Riot and Sydney Losserot may have ended, but the Vagrant story has just begun. Now, at the risk of repeating myself, it's just masterful storytelling. Matsuno and his team were operating on a level of cinematic ambition that was virtually unheard of in the industry at this point, managing to craft a story that is both cohesive and gripping, but also overflowing with ambiguity that's ripe to be analysed. Like the very best movies and novels, the year of its release is irrelevant, because whether you experienced it in 2000 or 2023, inventive writing and clever direction are timeless. And if you care at all about the storytelling potential of video games, Vagrant Story deserves your respect as one of the finest examples of what this medium can be. And so this brings us to the contradiction at the heart of the game, and something I've really been thinking about as I made this video. While Vagrant Story's narrative is inarguably among the best the industry has ever produced, the same can't be said for its gameplay, which, while engaging and creative, does have some very sharp edges that many people simply won't be able to overcome. That's partly why I've tried to cover the story in such detail, because I'm sure there will be people out there who want to experience the events in Lea Monde without having to actually play the game. Unlike a movie or a novel, there's a high barrier of entry, and that comes in the form of hyper-complex dungeon crawling and mind-bending crafting systems, both of which mean you can't lightly go into Vagrant Story. It's an experience that asks a huge amount of those who would undertake it, and while its rewards are well worth the effort, that's not exactly the direction the industry was moving in. Now, this will be important as we return to Yasumi Matsuno's career and what happened to him in the years following Vagrant Story's release, but before we wrap things up, we have one final stop to make. A hidden world within Lea Monde that few players ever see. Rather surprisingly, Vagrant Story has an extremely impressive spread of post-game content, and much like the rest of the experience, it's far more ambitious than it has any right to be. Once the credits roll, you're given the option to create a clear save, which you can then select from the main menu and start over from scratch. Well, not exactly from scratch, as while you lose your miscellaneous items, keys and sigils, you retain all of your stats, your break arts and spells, and crucially, your equipment. Now obviously this means you start off at a ludicrously high power level, and as you can skip cutscenes, you'll fly through the game at warp speed. During my second run, I made it to Snowfly Forest, which is around halfway through the game in just under an hour, devastating every single boss in seconds and barely taking any damage. It's a lot of fun, but breaking the game isn't the real reason to dive into a second playthrough, as that is found in the game's new areas. In this version of Vagrant Story, Ashley has the blood sin carved onto his back, and this allows us to open those doors that were sealed by the ensanguined Rood. And this begins a side quest where we hunt down 3 new keys made of bronze, silver and gold. This takes us into the forest where we defeat the Damascus Crab, into the bowels of the keep to slay the Damascus Golem, and then finally beneath the Undercity into an area called the Escapeway. Haunting this section of the map are a host of elemental djinn, and once you slice through them, you can leap across an underground reservoir and grab the final gold key. With all 3 in hand, you can head to the main event, which is a massive 3-floor dungeon called the Iron Maiden, which is located off of a side room in the Lea Monde keep. Now the Iron Maiden is quite interesting, as you can technically go there in your first playthrough, and if you're willing to take the risk, there are some fairly powerful items you can grab, which offer a sequence-breaking power boost. Thing is, if you wait until after you've beaten Guildenstern, the first floor, consisting of 23 rooms full of fairly mediocre enemies, won't pose much of a challenge, and it can be a little underwhelming. Luckily, the second floor more than makes up for this, and it's this labyrinthine section which is gated behind the bronze, silver and gold keys. Structurally, it works a little like the forest, with a maze-like layout that teleports you around the level and renders your map pretty useless. To make matters even worse, every room looks identical, so it's very hard to find your bearings once you do get lost. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, all of the enemies here are just regular bosses from the main game, which means you'll be spending your time fighting ogre lords, liches and a whole host of elemental dragons, all of which are a massive drain on your resources and can easily kill an unprepared adventurer. So what's the point of all this? Well, you're doing it for two reasons. Firstly, a new set of sigils, which we'll talk about in a minute, and secondly, a new tier of loot. That's right, in New Game Plus you gain access to a new workshop, God Hands in the Undercity, which allows you to craft Damascus gear. Now this is something of a controversial feature, as Vagrant Story fanatics are surprisingly torn on the benefits of upgrading your gear to this level. You see, Damascus is more powerful than Hagane, but not by that much more, and the amount of effort required to create a full set of high tier Damascus armour could easily take you 4 or 5 full playthroughs. In order to craft it, you have to combine Hagane and silver equipment, both of which are only found in the late game zones, with silver being particularly rare. So realistically, Damascus items are something you'll end up with if you're lucky, rather than something you can legitimately plan to make. By the end of 2 full playthroughs, I had precisely 1 Damascus item, an extremely powerful one-handed mace, which was certainly satisfying to use, but not so satisfying that I wanted to spend 20 more hours getting another. Now that being said, some players might still view this as mandatory, as the final boss of the Iron Maiden is a ridiculously powerful monster called the Azura, which you'll need every single advantage possible if you want to defeat. It has 999 HP, big resistances to every single affinity, the ability to block chain attacks, and quite a few of its spells can kill you outright. It is a challenge worthy of its hidden super boss status, except for one tiny weakness. You see, her AI is coded to highly prioritise self-buffing, but as you can only have a single buff active at any one time, you can use this to trick her into never attacking. By casting Lead Bones, which reduces agility, you can trap her in a cycle of buffing and debuffing, which gives you a wide enough window to get in some attacks, which, as I'm sure you've already guessed, usually have to be break arts. It's a slow and painful process, but one which works. And if you have the patience, even an underpowered Ashley can chip Azura to death. Now with her gone, the Iron Maiden is defeated, and your reward is a set of Hagane Hoplite armour, which is very useful, as you can combine this with a set you've already made in order to make Jezeraint armour. If you're masochistic enough, you can run through the whole thing 2 more times in 2 more playthroughs, which will give you enough resources to craft Dread armour. But you're probably thinking, with Azura dead, what would be the point of doing that? Well, the answer is in those sigils that we discussed earlier. Remember how the keep is full of 8 locked doors? Well, they open with the sigils dropped by the bosses in the Iron Maiden, and inside each one is a time trial, testing how quickly you can defeat different strength monsters from throughout the game. Now personally, I love this idea, as it brings back that timer mechanic from the Abandoned Mine, freezing the clock whenever you take an action and allowing you to really plan out the fastest way to dispatch these beasts. For the hardcore that just can't get enough of Vagrant Story's combat, it's a lovely place to leave things, as it's essentially endless content, even giving you another version of Azura which you can throw yourself against with all that hard-earned Damascus and Dread gear. Even then you're not entirely finished, as Vagrant Story has a sort of proto-achievement system called titles, which are awarded for doing things like opening every chest, filling out every room on the map, and getting an excellent rating in each of the time trials. The most interesting ones double as challenge modes, asking you to beat the game without using chain attacks or without using break arts, and even without saving. All extremely hard, but all perfectly possible. Considering how much focus went into Vagrant Story's narrative and how much development time that must have taken up, you really have to give Matsuno and his team credit for just how replayable this game is. Everything from the Iron Maiden to the time trials to the new gear and the titles all feel really well thought out. And if you find yourself enjoying the game's strange take on dungeon crawling, this content is just as vital as anything that happens in the Grand Cathedral or the Temple of Kilita. Now if you pair this with a narrative that's been purposefully designed to be enjoyed from multiple different angles and reveal clues on subsequent viewings, well, you've got a game that really rewards you for playing on after the credits. So if we go back to Matsuno's original aims, to create something fresh, to create something that defied categorization, to buck the tired trends of the genre, and to write something with real depth, well, you've got to say that even with the game's quirks and oddities, he was entirely successful. Even from our modern vantage point, it's easy to see why Vagrant Story made such an impact with critics, and that perfect score from Famitsu, even after we've examined its flaws, looks totally justified. So we return to the puzzle that began this video. If Vagrant Story is such a transcendent video game experience, and Yasumi Matsuno a genius of the medium, what exactly happened to them? While critics adored Vagrant Story's unique design and cinematic story, Square had a hard time translating these accolades into sales. And after just a few months, it was clear that Matsuno's masterpiece was going to be something of a niche title. Originally they had hoped for around 500,000 units sold in Japan, another 500,000 in America, and then 200,000 to 300,000 in Europe, but after 30 days, Vagrant Story had shipped just 100,000 units worldwide. And with the PlayStation 2 releasing just a few weeks later, it was going to be virtually impossible to hit those goals. In fact, the new generation really killed much of Vagrant Story's marketing momentum. While Matsuno's game looked breathtaking for a PS1 title, it was tough to compete with the next-gen visuals of PS2 launch titles like Summoner and Eternal Ring, even if it was a far more polished experience with far better reviews. On top of this, advertising was also pretty challenging, as much of what makes Vagrant Story special is quite hard to quickly summarise, and the TV ad campaign ended up going with a CGI trailer that doesn't really have much to do with fantasy dungeon crawling or amnesiac secret agents. While the game did eventually turn a profit, it was still miles off of the sort of numbers that Squaresoft were used to seeing, and so you might presume that this is what killed Matsuno's career. But funnily enough, it was quite the opposite. Rather than punishing him for the game's underwhelming sales, he was instead given even more responsibility and was placed in charge of two major projects. The first was a handheld title for Nintendo's Game Boy Advance, as after a decade-long split, Square had patched things up with the Big N and were back developing for their platforms. This led to Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, which took the concepts of Matsuno's first PS1 title and reimagined them in colourful 32 bits, telling a story of 4 young children who are teleported to Evilis and then have to work out how to get home and if they even want to. The development team featured lots of Vagrant Story alumni like Minagawa, Yoshida, Akiyama and Sakamoto, and thanks to this, they produced a really high quality game that sold 1.5 million copies when it was released in 2003. Now Matsuno couldn't take full credit for this as he was only involved as a producer, and that was because the lion's share of his attention was focused on the development of Final Fantasy XII. That's right, after Vagrant Story, he'd been entrusted with the directorship of the next big numbered Final Fantasy game, and as he was being reunited with Hiroyuki Ito, who he'd designed Tactics with, expectations were through the roof. This was going to be his Metal Gear Solid moment, where he transitioned from cult auteur to mainstream maestro, and in all of the press, it seemed like the game would be everything that fans wanted. Final Fantasy XII would again be set in Evilis, but thousands of years before Final Fantasy Tactics, and while there would be a heavy dose of Vagrant Story style conspiracy, his aim was to take the maximalism of Star Wars and tell a true fantasy war epic. Previews detailed an RPG with no battle screens, no world map, complex AI that can be programmed by players, and a living economy full of merchants, bounty hunters, and scavengers. As Square were in the midst of another golden age, putting out stellar titles like Final Fantasy X and X-2, Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, and even managing to successfully launch an MMO, Final Fantasy XI, there was little reason to doubt that anything could go wrong. And then, it did. In 2003, Square's spiritual father, Hironobu Sakaguchi, had decided to leave the company after his movie, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, bombed at the box office and put Square into the red. Now originally Sakaguchi had retired, but quickly he grew restless, and in 2004 he re-entered the industry with a new company called Mistwalker that would be directly competing with Square Enix thanks to the financial backing of Microsoft. In their first press release they announced 3 games, each of which was designed to scalp a chunk of Square's market and tempt RPG lovers over to the Xbox 360. These were Blue Dragon, Lost Odyssey, and Ash Archaic Sealed Heat, which were clearly riffs on Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy, and Fire Emblem. Now, just like with Quest a decade earlier, Mistwalker quickly began poaching staff to work on these games, and after finding out that a portion of his Final Fantasy XII team would be making the jump, Matsuno's downfall began. On June 7, 2005, OneUp.com reported that Yasumi Matsuno had been removed from Final Fantasy XII as he had been refusing to work, derailing the game's development in protest at the staffing situation caused by Sakaguchi. Rumours swirled, and a month later, Square confirmed that this had indeed happened, but according to them, Matsuno had been replaced so that he could recover from a serious health issue. Now, if that wasn't confusing enough, Matsuno put out his own statement, stating that he wasn't having a break, but stepping away from the production scene altogether, and that Final Fantasy XII was being left in capable hands. Curiously, there was no mention of why he was doing this, and not a word about any supposed illness. Obviously, this was massive news, and the internet ignited with theories about what exactly was going on. Had he been fired and Square were just allowing him to save face with the illness story? Maybe the stress of stepping into Sakaguchi's shoes and managing 2 high-profile teams had proven too much and he'd had a breakdown. There were even theories that this had happened because Matsuno was headed to Mistwalker, with Sakaguchi going back to steal a developer who he clearly loved. Just like the ambiguous mysteries within Vagrant Story, all we have to work with are fragments and hearsay. And there's never been any concrete explanation as to why Yasumi Matsuno left Square. Now, what makes this all the more puzzling is that he didn't entirely disappear and would pop up in a series of strange roles over the next 2 decades. Had he simply taken an early retirement, the illness story might make sense, and if he jumped ship to another developer, we could believe that he'd been fired, but the reality doesn't line up with either of these theories. The first post-Square appearance was in 2006, where he briefly featured in a Nintendo press conference talking about the potential of the upcoming Wii. Now, that might make you think that he had some motion control project that he was cooking in the background, but that was not the case, and the only work he ever did on the console was as part of the writing team for Platinum Games' 2009 release, Mad World. A year later, he was back at Square-Enix, contributing to a remake of Tactics Ogre, but again, this was only as a freelance writer, as the project was led by Hiroshi Minagawa, and he'd apparently had to beg Matsuno to join the team. 2 years after that, he was at Factor 5, working on a small 3DS eShop game called Crimson Shroud. Now, while this saw him finally return to the lead design role, the game was so small in scale and so cheaply produced that it didn't really feel like a continuation of his work from the 1990s. He'd even eventually take a contract at Sakaguchi's Mistwalker, contributing a scenario for their mobile game, Terror Battle, but again, for fans of his complex system design and high concept writing, this was thin pickings and nothing to get excited over. For a man who had once shared the limelight with Hideo Kojima, that had received the 3rd ever Famitsu Perfect score, that had been hand-picked to succeed Hironobu Sakaguchi, well, it was an incredible fall from grace, and something that there's almost no comparison with in the video game industry's short history. Personally, I believe his post-Vagrant Story career adds a lot of credence to the rumour that he had permanently burnt out, as every project since Final Fantasy XII was far less high stakes, with nothing like the pressure that he would have been under while directing and producing complex big-budget games. It's easy to look at video games and ignore the humans behind their creation, so while I'd have loved to have seen his finished vision for Final Fantasy XII, or what he might have crafted with the power of the PlayStation 3, if it was going to cost the man his life, I think it's a dream that we can allow to fade away. Now, thankfully, that wasn't quite the end of Yasumi Matsuno's relationship with the worlds that he crafted, as in 2017 he was asked by Yoshida to join the Final Fantasy XIV team. Yoshida was a massive fan of Final Fantasy Tactics, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII, and the idea was that Matsuno would help design and write a series of storylines that would take players into a reimagined version of those games. This partnership led to the beloved Return to Evilis and Save the Queen raids, which featured famous Matsuno locations like Orbon Monastery and the city of Dalmasca. It was all great stuff, but sadly, these would be the only raids the two produced together, and a mythical third one based on Vagrant Story and set in Lea Monde. Well, that too has to be relegated to the stuff of dreams. Just like the events of that summer day haunting Ashley Riot's past, there's no clear answer for what happened to Yasumi Matsuno during the development of Final Fantasy XII, and why such a talented director and gifted writer chose to step away from the profession he was born to do. All we know is that given his output over the last 2 decades, a full-blooded return to frontline development will almost certainly never happen. And while this is a tragedy for those of us that love the complexity and ambition that he brought to the industry, it doesn't leave us empty-handed. We still have the games he produced while at Quest and Square, and so this brings us to a final riddle. What happens to Vagrant Story now that its creator is gone? Can there ever be hope for a new sunrise over Lea Monde? After finishing work on the Save the Queen questline for Final Fantasy XIV, Yasumi Matsuno took to Twitter and revealed that he'd taken inspiration from a story treatment that he'd written long ago when working on a potential Vagrant Story 2. This came as a huge surprise, and after some good-natured pressure by fans, Matsuno released the short prologue that he'd come up with. The game would revolve around a bounty hunter called Jack, who uses his abilities as a heartseer to hunt down targets and extract information from those who refuse to share it willingly. One day Jack is contracted by Duke Joshua Bardorba in order to hunt down the ultimate prey, a mysterious figure of impossible power and the last person to see Jack's mother, Calo Malose, alive. For just a few lines, it's surprisingly engaging and an interesting direction to take a sequel, exploring the effects of the Lea Monde incident on the children of those who survived, and positioning Ashley not as the protagonist, but as a mythological antagonist, looming over what remains of Valendia. As thrilling as it was to peer into what could have been, ultimately this reveal was tinged with sadness, as after 2 decades of near inactivity, it was clear that the Matsuno of the 1990s was gone, and without his involvement, surely Vagrant Story couldn't return. Well, I'm not sure it's as ridiculous as you might assume. After Matsuno left Square, the directorship of Final Fantasy XII was entrusted to his longtime collaborator, Hiroshi Minagawa, and despite its chaotic development, the finished product was a monstrous success, selling 5 million copies in its first year and securing Square's second ever Famitsu Perfect score. Clearly, Minagawa was more than comfortable executing Matsuno's vision, and this was further proven when a few years later he helmed the development of a PSP remake of Tactics Ogre. With a further fleshed out story that allowed players to return to narrative branches, remixed gameplay that lessened the obtuse systems but without losing any complexity, and updated high-resolution visuals, it was seen as the definitive version of Quest's Super Nintendo classic, and another Minagawa success story. Oddly, he never ended up creating anything that was entirely of his own making, but when working with a foundation laid by Yasumi Matsuno, he seemed to be able to trim away the nonsense and hone the quality to a razor-sharp edge. Now, Minagawa is still working at Square, which means the possibility of a Vagrant Story remake, one which honours the intentions of its creator but brings it into the modern age, well, it's not quite as far-fetched as you might think. So, what would a Vagrant Story remake look like? Well, judging by how Minagawa approached Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy XII, I think we can assume that the presentation, structure and story would remain broadly the same. And considering it is by far the strongest part of the game, this is a no-brainer. Instead, I think it's in the gameplay systems where we would see the biggest changes. Much of what makes Vagrant Story frustrating to play stems from how it communicates its systems and how it asks you to engage with them, both of which can be resolved without having to undergo major surgery. For example, if you only had to analyse an enemy once and then had the information appear whenever they enter your targeting ring, much of the combat repetition would be removed. Similarly, the ability to quickly change weapons like you can spells and items would dramatically speed up the pace and encourage experimentation without forcing you into endless menus. Obviously, the crafting system would need to be rebalanced and most likely redesigned to be a lot more player friendly, but in a funny coincidence, Minagawa introduced crafting to his Tactics Ogre remake and it was quite well executed, which gives me hope that he could fix what is quite a broken system. Now, if we're being more ambitious, on next generation hardware, it would be great to see Lea Monde's areas desegregated, and their many rooms blended into seamless environments. This would not only improve the sense of scale and atmosphere, but allow for more of that Metroid-style exploration, and allow the Dead City to take on even more prominence within the gameplay. I'm usually loath to make this comparison, but From Software's Dark Souls showed that it's possible to blend action RPG gameplay with complex 3D level design, and I really think that a potential Vagrant Story remake, taking influence from this philosophy, could be a big success. Dark and dramatic fantasy is all the rage in 2023, and given Square have in recent years almost completely converted to producing big budget action RPGs, it really does seem like a match made in heaven. Hell, even if they wanted to go in the direction of Final Fantasy VII Remake, you could easily envision a version of Ashley Riot in Lea Monde that brought fast-paced dodging into the equation, and maybe replicated the body part targeting with a Fallout-style VATS system. The foundations are there for something that could genuinely work in the modern market, and thanks to the mystique that is built up around Matsuno's final game, I think it would garner a lot of attention and excite people who either never experienced the original or were put off by its rough edges. It's a tantalising prospect, but let me present a counter-argument, a conflicting interpretation of how this tale should end. So much of what makes Vagrant Story so charming is the hardware that it was built for, and how its development team creatively worked around these restrictions. There's a real risk that by bringing it into the gleaming world of high definition, you'd lose some of its soul, and by sanding down those edges, you'd take away much of what makes it a unique experience. Those incredible facial textures, the beautiful text bubbles, the way the music loops in place while you read, all of this would be lost if the cutscenes were remade in the Unreal Engine. And that's without even talking about voice acting, which can easily ruin even the finest script. The fact that Vagrant Story is such a cinematic experience on the PlayStation 1 is partly why it's so memorable, and by dragging it into a world where it's in competition with The Last of Us and God of War, well, you're failing to appreciate its jagged lo-fi beauty. Even if the changes were kept solely to the gameplay, you have to wonder if that would remove some of its being, and if what we ended up with wouldn't be Vagrant Story anymore, but something entirely different. Meaningful art isn't a perfectly functional product or a 10 out of 10 review, and the most worthwhile experiences aren't always those that are the best made. Flaws and mistakes are part of the creation process, and the contrast they provide can often make the good shine all the brighter. If you want to experience Vagrant Story in its ideal video game form, a remake might one day provide that. But if you want to sit down and play through the flawed vision of a flawed man, well, frankly, there's no substitute for what we already have. Ultimately, just like Matsuno did, I'll leave the conclusion up to you. There is no clear answer, no obvious path back for Ashley and Yasumi. Only a game and a man that don't deserve to be forgotten. Thanks for watching. So here is where I'd usually give a special thanks to my patrons, but I want to extend that to everyone who's subscribed, commented, liked or shared the videos. And that's because recently the channel ticked over 100,000 subscribers. Originally I dreamt of hitting that goal by the end of the year, so to do it almost 6 months early feels amazing. And it's down to everyone's support that things seem to be going so well. Of course, if you want to help keep ads to a minimum and sponsorships to a rarity, then supporting the channel on Patreon really makes a massive difference. And I've got some cool features coming, like a post-retrospective podcast, which for Vagrant Story will feature Madular and Sean Shaunson, and should be out in a few weeks. Otherwise, I'll either see you in the comments or over on Twitch on Thursdays and Sundays. Hope you enjoyed the video. I'll catch you on the next one.